The good news? Rome had a new heir. The bad news? He once tried to command his bathwater to obey him. Born in 1601 AD with a silver spoon, a golden crib, and an empire already gift-wrapped for him, Lucius Aurelius Commodus was not your average Roman child. Most kids in ancient Rome learned how to sharpen swords, recite Cicero, and generally survive the plague. Commodus? He learned how to be carried by servants, expectations, and eventually, history's most infamous ego trip. His father, Marcus Aurelius, was a philosopher king, the kind of ruler who quoted Stoic wisdom while walking through plague-ridden battlefields and trying not to look disappointed in humanity. His idea of a good time was writing down deep thoughts like, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy," while Commodus's idea of a good time was naming all his toys after himself and throwing them at people who didn't clap. Let's be clear, Marcus was not some rugged, emotionless statue of a man. He was a worn-out emperor who held the Roman Empire together with little more than patience, duct tape, and philosophical monologues. He had 14 children with his wife Faustina the Younger, and Commodus was one of the few who survived childhood, a feat worthy of a laurel wreath by itself. Unfortunately, he survived a bit too well. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, how Emperor Commodus brought down an empire, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button. But only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Commodus wasn't just born into royalty. He was born to rule. Unlike previous emperors who were adopted based on merit, chosen for competence, leadership, or at least the ability to string together two coherent thoughts, Commodus was Marcus Aurelius's biological son. In fact, he was the first emperor born in the purple, a term used for children born during their parents' reign. And in Commodus's case, he used that purple not to rule wisely, but to make fashion statements. By the age of 5, Commodus was already declared Caesar, basically the Roman version of saying, this is the future. Most 5-year-olds were still figuring out how to not eat rocks. Commodus was attending imperial ceremonies wearing tiny togas and developing a royal attitude that could curdle goat's milk. Even during his early years, red flags were waving like victory banners. Tutors wrote that Commodus was intelligent when he felt like it, but prone to laziness, entitled behavior, and a lack of interest in anything that didn't involve him being the center of attention. One poor servant was reportedly burned alive when Commodus complained his bath was too cold, and you thought your boss was bad. Marcus Aurelius, bless him, tried his best. He brought Commodus on military campaigns to toughen him up. While Marcus was writing meditations on the meaning of life, Commodus was probably throwing javelins at squirrels and calling it training. One was trying to master virtue, the other was mastering the art of delegation, preferably while lying down. Still, the public had hope. After all, Commodus had the blood of Marcus Aurelius. That had to count for something, right? Surely the son of Rome's philosopher-emperor would carry the torch, uphold Stoic ideals, and lead with honor. Spoiler, he absolutely would not. But in those early days, before the gladiator costumes and self-declared godhood, people still squinted hard enough to see potential. Sure, he was a little vain. Sure, he had a servants adjust furniture kind of vibe. But maybe he'd grow out of it. Maybe the pressure of ruling the world would humble him. Instead, it inflated him like a parade balloon. Commodus received the best education Rome could offer. Top philosophers, military tutors, language experts. And while he technically completed all his training, it's safe to say he was more interested in learning how to pose like a hero in statues than understanding the finer points of jurisprudence. By his teens, he had already developed a taste for the finer things: scented oils, golden cups, and long afternoons of doing absolutely nothing productive. While Marcus worked his fingers to the bone, keeping the empire from falling apart, Commodus lounged around acting like ruling was just another form of background applause. At one point, Marcus even made his son co-emperor, a sort of glorified internship, where Commodus could learn how to manage an empire by watching Dad do all the work. But this wasn't so much mentoring as it was dragging a bored teenager through the greatest ruling balancing act of the ancient world. The cracks were already forming, not in the empire yet, but in Commodus himself. He wasn't cruel just yet, not unhinged, but the ingredients were all there: a fragile ego, unchecked privilege, and the attention span of a distracted peacock. And so, Rome watched and waited, hoping he'd grow into the role, hoping Marcus Aurelius's wisdom would somehow sink in, hoping this golden boy wouldn't drop the empire like a glass of imported wine. They would be disappointed, very, very soon. The year was 1880 AD, and Rome was quietly preparing to pass the imperial baton from one of its greatest emperors to, well, someone, anyone. Surely not that guy lounging in rosewater baths and humming about his reflection in silver mirrors. But yes, it was Commodus. It was always going to be Commodus. When Marcus Aurelius passed away, likely from plague, battlefield stress, or sheer disappointment, Rome braced itself, not for grief, not even for chaos, but for the overwhelming sensation that the grown-ups had left the room, and the child now in charge was more interested in party planning than governance. Marcus had passed away while campaigning in modern-day Austria, having spent the last years of his life camped out in freezing tents, dodging arrows, and contemplating the futility of existence. You know, standard Roman emperor stuff. His passings left his 18-year-old son Commodus as sole ruler of the largest empire in the known world, a job traditionally reserved for men who at least pretended to care about it. And what did Commodus do with his very first breath as emperor? He went home. Not to Rome, mind you. Not to the Senate. Not even to the front lines where Rome's legions were still locked in bitter conflict. No. Commodus turned to his generals and said something that historians have loosely translated as, "Oh, I'm so over this." The young emperor signed a peace treaty with the Marcomannic tribes, not because Rome had decisively won, but because the war was interrupting his spa schedule. These were the same barbarian groups his father had fought for over a decade. Commodus looked at that legacy and said, "No thanks," before packing up and heading back to his palatial comfort zone like he'd just ditched gym class. This wasn't just laziness, it was a massive signal. Rome's priorities had shifted overnight, from duty and expansion to self-preservation and luxury. The legions were stunned, the Senate was offended, and the barbarians, they were probably confused but grateful. Once back in Rome, Commodus immediately outsourced the hard stuff. Running an empire? No thanks. There were baths to soak in, wines to sample, and mirrors to stare into. So he handed power to a small clique of advisors, flatterers, and glorified babysitters. Chief among them were Sautyrus, a freedman from Nicomedia, who managed imperial correspondence like an overly ambitious HR rep, and Perennis, the Praetorian prefect who would later become a kind of evil puppet master with fancier sandals. These men weren't selected for competence, they were selected because they told Commodus he looked nice in a lion skin cape. That's the level of vetting we're talking about here. Meanwhile, the Roman Senate watched this all unfold with the horror of people watching someone drop a priceless vase and then try to glue it back together with cheese. They had just lost a Stoic philosopher ruler, a man who read Greek in his spare time. Now, they had a teenager who thought the only thing worth conquering was the dessert table. The empire didn't crumble, not right away. Rome was sturdy, the bureaucracy was massive, the army still mostly respected itself, but it was as if the soul of Rome had been swapped out for an overfed golden retriever with a fondness for costumes, and no one knew how to tell it no. One of Commodus's early moves back in the capital was to cancel a traditional victory procession, a military parade that normally celebrated Roman triumph over its enemies. He didn't feel like riding a horse through a cheering crowd that day. Instead, he threw a lavish party for himself, celebrating the victory he hadn't actually won. There were dancers, fountains of wine, and, because it's Commodus, a self-composed poem performed by hired minstrels in which he compared himself to the sun. Now, Rome had seen eccentric emperors before, Caligula once declared war on the ocean and ordered soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of battle. Nero set fire to parts of his own city and then blamed the Christians. But Commodus felt different. He wasn't just mad, he was deliberately uninterested in the boring mechanics of empire. He didn't want to fix things, he wanted to be adored. Behind the scenes, his advisors were reshuffling Rome's internal politics like they were playing with monopoly money. Corruption became systemic. Bribes were no longer scandalous. They were expected. Promotions were based not on merit but on who could complement the emperor's calves the most convincingly. Real policy took a back seat to pageantry, and governance became something you whispered about while Commodus practiced his heroic poses. And yet, through all this, Rome remained mostly quiet, because for the first time in a while, nobody was actively dying in a war. Bread still arrived, the baths were still warm. People shrugged and said, maybe he'll grow out of it. But deep beneath the marble and incense, something had cracked. Commodus hadn't broken the empire. Not yet, but he had bent it. He shifted its center of gravity from civic virtue to vanity, from statecraft to stagecraft. And while Rome sighed and adjusted, history sharpened its pen. It was going to be a very long and very strange reign. At some point during his reign, Commodus looked at the vast ancient city of Rome, its temples, its columns, its centuries of culture and tradition, and thought, you know what would make this better? Me. And thus began what historians politely call the narcissism phase. Less polite historians might call it the full delusion detour with extra marble. In most empires, rulers leave behind monuments to their legacy. Commodus, he decided to live inside his legacy in real time, renaming absolutely everything that didn't move fast enough, including the city of Rome itself, which he helpfully rebranded as Colonia Commodiana, or the Colony of Commodus. Yes, the most powerful city in the known world, the beating heart of a civilization spanning 3 continents, was renamed like a startup in a midlife crisis. The rebranding didn't stop at street signs. Commodus went full interior decorator on the empire, renaming temples, public buildings, legions, festivals, and even the fleet. What had once been sacred spaces were now shrines to his ego. Imagine walking into the Temple of Jupiter only to find it now called the House of Commodus, supreme puncher of lions. Even the Roman calendar, a structure already complicated by Julius Caesar's leap year shenanigans, was not safe. Commodus decided to rename all the months of the year after himself, of course. Gone were boring old September and October. In their place came a parade of Commodus-inspired titles like Lucius, Aurelius, Commodus, Augustus, Hercules, and Invictus, all names he had claimed as his own. If you were trying to plan a birthday party, you now had to ask, wait, is it in Hercules or Commodus the code? In total, he gave himself no fewer than 12 official names, and then made the public use all of them when addressing him. That's right, if you were a humble Roman baker just trying to ask for tax relief, you had to begin with something like, to our Lord and Master, Lucius Aelius Aurelius Commodus Augustus, invincible, victorious, unconquered, pious, Felix, the Roman Hercules, supreme savior of the world, at which point you've probably passed out from lack of oxygen before making your request. But Commodus wasn't content just renaming things, he wanted to look the part too. That's when the empire began drowning in statues of Commodus not just as emperor, but as Hercules. Nearly every public square, military outpost and bathhouse now featured a glorious marble version of the emperor, wearing a lion's skin over his head, wielding a wooden club, and often standing on top of a pile of writhing enemies or, confusingly, grapes. These statues weren't just for show, they were state propaganda, designed to blend Commodus's image with divine power. He wasn't just ruling as Commodus anymore, he was now Hercules Romanus, the reincarnated muscle god sent to save Rome by flexing aggressively at it. Inscriptions popped up everywhere. Coins were minted bearing phrases like the conqueror of the world and restorer of the golden age. To hear Commodus tell it, the empire was doing better than ever. In reality, it was like watching a house on fire while the owner insists it's just the candles being festive. Behind the curtain of glory, statues and month naming, Rome was visibly squirming. The Senate hated him, but had to clap. The people were confused, but enjoyed the free grain, and the military was growing restless, because lions don't pay bribes and calendars don't fight wars. To make matters worse, Commodus started referring to his subjects as his gladiators. The Roman people, the Senate, even the army, all were now his adoring fan club and/or background extras in the imperial fantasy saga running inside his head. He was no longer the Emperor of Rome. He was the main character in a one-man theatrical empire called Commodusland. He even commissioned a colossal statue of himself as Hercules, reportedly over 30 feet tall, to be placed in the city center, so that no one under any circumstance could forget who was boss. It was said to have been so lavishly decorated with gold, jewels and narcissism that it nearly bankrupted the treasury just to keep it polished. And if all that wasn't enough to secure his spot in the pantheon of peculiar, Commodus took the ultimate step. He insisted on being worshipped as a living god. Temples were ordered to install altars to his divine self. Priests had to make sacrifices to him. Citizens were expected to bow not just in respect but in religious devotion. He was no longer merely emperor. He was a divine being, sent to earth to bless the empire with his gym-toned glory, renaming skills, and lion-murdering hobbies. The terrifying part? No one could stop him. The machinery of empire kept chugging along beneath the glittering nonsense. Roads still got paved. Taxes were collected, but the empire's identity, its dignity, its gravitas, its very name had been hijacked by a man who thought the most pressing issue facing Rome was insufficient statues of himself holding a club. And so the Roman world looked around and realized it wasn't living in an empire anymore. It was living in a very elaborate, very expensive Commodus fan fiction. And the author was just getting started. If there's one thing Emperor Commodus loved more than looking at statues of himself, it was making sure everyone watched him look heroic in real time. That's right, Rome's most powerful man fancied himself not just a god, but a gladiator too. And not just any gladiator, but the main event, the headliner, the let's all pretend this isn't horrifyingly inappropriate star of the show. So buckle your sandals, because this chapter is a ringside seat to one of the most bizarre phases in Roman imperial history, when the emperor traded a laurel wreath for a wooden sword and demanded applause for stabbing giraffes. Let's get one thing straight. Gladiators were not celebrities in ancient Rome. They were mostly enslaved people, criminals or prisoners of war. Their job was to bleed for entertainment. Their life expectancy was short, their glory fleeting, and their working conditions could best be described as, "Please don't sneeze too hard or your ribs will fall out." So imagine the confusion when the emperor himself, the man who ran the entire known world, decided that his true calling was not managing the empire, but playing dress-up and beating up half-dead people in front of a cheering crowd. At first, Romans weren't sure if Commodus was serious, but then he strolled into the arena in full gladiator gear, not the lightweight stuff, mind you, but a golden helmet, lion skin, and Hercules cosplay, so dramatic it made local actors look underdressed. He didn't just fight once, or twice, he fought hundreds of matches. And no, he didn't risk his life. His opponents were carefully chosen, injured gladiators, elderly men, or people who had the unfortunate luck of being nearby and looking vaguely like they could be stabbed. Even the animals weren't safe. Commodus once strutted into the arena and personally slaughtered hundreds of exotic beasts, lions, elephants, ostriches, all while wearing his Hercules getup and flashing his god-complex smile. He used javelins, swords, and reportedly even decapitated an ostrich with a single stroke, then sauntered over to the senators and silently waved its severed head at them, as if to say, "Yes, this is your emperor, you're welcome." It wasn't just performative narcissism, though there was plenty of that. It was also a power move. The Roman Senate, the aristocracy, and the upper crust of society were all dragged into the Colosseum to watch these battles. Not attending wasn't an option. Cheering wasn't optional either. Senators who failed to clap with sufficient enthusiasm could find themselves demoted, exiled, or mysteriously vanished. It was like being forced to go to a child's school play, except the child is wielding a sword, is also your boss, and occasionally kills a rhino on stage. Naturally, the people of Rome had opinions. Some found it wildly entertaining. Free tickets, blood, and a front row seat to an ego in full bloom. Others were horrified. Emperors were supposed to be dignified. They were meant to command armies, settle legal disputes, and hand out grain, not stage amateur WWE matches. But Commodus didn't care. In fact, he had a little sideline. He charged the Roman treasury for his performances. That's right, Commodus actually billed the state for his time in the arena. Imagine your CEO moonlighting as a birthday clown and submitting expense reports for balloon animals. But wait, there's more. Commodus also demanded titles for his glorious victories. He referred to himself as victor of 1,000 battles, conqueror of the arena, and most absurdly, champion of all time. No one dared to point out that his opponents often couldn't walk unaided, let alone fight. He even declared himself the new Romulus, the founder of Rome, and started rebranding everything from temples to snack stands with his own image and arena accomplishments. As for the professional gladiators, they were deeply unimpressed. Many of them resented being forced to fake fights or lose on purpose. Some were quietly killed for daring to speak out. Others just did their best to survive the emperor's delusions. After all, it's hard to train for battle when your new opponent is also your god emperor, who thinks he's the reincarnation of Hercules and gets cranky when his lion pelt isn't fluffed correctly. Commodus's arena obsession wasn't just ridiculous. It was a public symbol of how far the empire had fallen under his rule. Rome's mighty institutions, its legal traditions, its carefully balanced bureaucracy, all of it had been replaced by a man in a costume swinging a sword at zoo animals, while the Senate clapped like terrified parents at a deranged talent show. In the end, Commodus's gladiator phase wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. It drained the treasury, humiliated the elite, and turned politics into performance art. Rome didn't have an emperor anymore. It had a mascot with a sword and a god complex. And while the Colosseum crowds may have cheered in the short term, behind the scenes whispers of rebellion began to grow louder. After all, how long can an empire survive when its emperor is too busy chasing applause to govern? And that, dear listener, is how Commodus turned the Colosseum into his personal stage. If ancient Rome had Yelp, Commodus's Senate would have gotten 1 star. Great architecture, but the emperor made me wear a chicken costume and now my cousin's missing. By the time Commodus really hit his stride as emperor, or more accurately his delusional ego crescendo, Roman politics had less to do with policy and more to do with surviving whatever mood swing the emperor was enjoying that morning. Gone were the days of stoic debates and dignified discourse. Under Commodus, the Senate was transformed into a strange hybrid of gladiator ring, theatre stage, and hostage crisis. These weren't the proud days of Cato and Cicero. No, these were the please don't make me act out a Greek tragedy in a toga and clown shoes kind of days. Let's start with how Commodus viewed the Senate. Like a private improv troupe, he neither respected nor particularly enjoyed. As a child of privilege with a deeply inflated sense of divine destiny, see Hercules cosplay, Chapter 3, Commodus saw the Senate as an annoying group of people who kept reminding him that being emperor came with responsibilities. He responded to this the way any mature adult would, by executing people who disagreed with him and replacing thoughtful dialogue with screaming matches, floggings, and highly awkward talent shows. Senators weren't just afraid of Commodus, they were petrified, and that's saying something for a group of men who built an empire by conquering most of Europe in sandals. The emperor was erratic, vindictive, and fond of playing who's expendable this week. One minute he'd be praising a senator's loyalty. The next minute that same senator was missing his head and buried in a ditch with a lion pelt shoved in his mouth for disrespecting the divine Hercules. The cruelty wasn't just lethal, it was theatrical. Commodus had a flair for the humiliating spectacle. Noblemen were sometimes forced to appear in front of the imperial court dressed in ridiculous costumes, enacting bizarre little plays or dances, while the emperor chuckled with a goblet of wine and a gladius in his lap. It wasn't politics. It was RuPaul's Roman Drag Race, hosted by a madman in a lion's skin who believed Jupiter personally approved his wardrobe choices. And if you think public floggings were rare or reserved for criminals, think again. Under Commodus, they became a regular civic activity like brunch, but with more blood. Entire audiences were summoned to watch noblemen get whipped or beaten simply because Commodus was bored and didn't like their energy. Senators lived in a constant state of anxiety, not over bills or wars, but whether they'd be next on the emperor's spontaneous public humiliation list. Imagine having to carefully word every greeting like, Ave, Emperor, Slayer of Beasts, Divine Descendant of Hercules, Keeper of Rome, and Owner of Really Great Hair, or risk being made to wrestle a bear. Spoiler, the bear always won. But perhaps the most absurd part was how Commodus rewarded loyalty. In normal times, that might mean a promotion, a statue, maybe a nice villa. Under Commodus, you might be invited to be his co-star in a weird theatrical performance that ended with your dramatic death, or be gifted a golden laurel while being forced to crawl across the Senate floor like a dog. If this sounds like a twisted fraternity hazing ritual, mixed with power politics and ancient delusion, it's because that's exactly what it was. Meanwhile, Rome's actual problems, crumbling infrastructure, dwindling resources, border instability, were completely ignored. The emperor had no time for those boring state affairs when he was busy turning the Senate chamber into a personal circus tent. And if anyone dared complain, Commodus would simply accuse them of treason, a charge which, under his reign, could be triggered by offenses as serious as not laughing hard enough at his joke about Jupiter's thunderbolt. Roman traditions that had stood for centuries were tossed aside like last season's sandals. The dignity of governance was shredded, stomped on, and then handed back to the senators with a fake mustache and a script for a play. Commodus had written called How I Am the Best, starring me, also written by me. One senator reportedly pretended to have lost his voice entirely for 2 months just to avoid giving any speeches that might inadvertently offend the emperor's delicate ears. That's right, Roman senators were literally faking laryngitis to stay alive. In the end, Commodus turned the Roman Senate into a traumatized theater troupe trapped in a Game of Thrones, hosted by a man who thought democracy rhymed with decapitate. Governance was no longer a noble duty. It was a tightrope act, walked in fear, over a pit filled with lions, laughter, and a very unstable man in a golden toga, demanding applause, and the applause had better be loud. By the time Emperor Commodus hit the halfway mark of his reign, Rome had already gone from noble republic to full-blown reality show. And Commodus, he was both the star and the villain. But even the most narcissistic emperors occasionally have to face reality, especially when that reality comes in the form of sharp daggers and whispered conspiracies. The first major attempt on his life came from within his own family. His sister Lucilla, yes, that Lucilla, decided that having a megalomaniac little brother in charge of the Roman Empire wasn't exactly the recipe for long-term stability. Perhaps she was tired of watching him prance around dressed like Hercules, or maybe it was the casual executions that made family dinners awkward. Whatever her reasons, Lucilla plotted to have Commodus removed. By removed, we mean stabbed repeatedly until he was more ex-brother than emperor. Her chosen assassin, a man who clearly missed the subtlety and timing workshop. During the attempt, instead of quickly dispatching the emperor, the assassin announced loudly and dramatically, "This is what the Senate sends you," before botching the whole thing. Imagine trying to sneak attack someone and giving a full TED talk beforehand. Unsurprisingly, Commodus survived. The assassin did not. Neither did Lucilla, who was promptly exiled and then executed, because nothing says family bonding like a good old-fashioned imperial purge. But Lucilla's failed attempt opened a floodgate. The emperor became less man of the people and more man peeking behind every curtain and stabbing shadows. After the plot, Commodus didn't just ramp up security, he basically turned the palace into a high-stakes paranoia palace. His inner circle got smaller, tighter, and significantly less opinionated. Disagreeing with the emperor became a quick path to the underworld. Even breathing in his direction with the wrong level of enthusiasm could result in a sudden, sharp goodbye. By 1804 AD, Commodus had turned his security detail into a one-man trust fall, with no one trusted and everyone falling. The palace staff rotated frequently because once he started suspecting someone, they were either fired or on fire. The Senate, already terrified, now sat through sessions hoping they wouldn't be accused of looking suspiciously like someone who might one day maybe think about plotting treason. This new policy of preemptive punishment meant entire families were arrested for crimes that hadn't even been imagined yet. This suspicion trickled down into the streets. Rome, a city once filled with political debates and oratory contests, now resembled a town where everyone kept their heads down and their voices lower. Any whisper might be heard by someone loyal to Commodus. Paranoia spread like wildfire, and like actual fire, which Commodus occasionally ordered just to remind everyone that the city was flammable, and so were its people. To make matters worse, as if they weren't already greased with absurdity, Commodus started relying heavily on astrologers and oracles, who told him what he wanted to hear, that he was divine, invincible, and universally beloved, right up until they mysteriously vanished. If the stars ever told the truth, they probably did it quietly, while packing a getaway bag. As his paranoia grew, so did his punishments. Executions were no longer reserved for traitors or political enemies. Now they extended to performers, cooks, and even musicians who hit the wrong note. You could be a loyal servant one moment, and the next you're being blamed for looking at Commodus's sandals the wrong way. And the irony, the more he purged his enemies, the more enemies he created. Rome had always been a dangerous place for emperors with enemies, but Commodus was managing to create them faster than he could kill them. His shrinking trust circle meant his actual ability to govern, already weak, evaporated entirely. His advisors were now either sycophants, terrified of speaking the truth, or manipulative opportunists, ready to push the next assassination plot when the timing was right. Which, spoiler alert, was coming. Every meal was suspect. Every corridor could conceal a traitor. He started skipping public appearances or wearing disguises. His public baths were emptied before he entered. His gladiatorial games became less about sport and more about him showing off his alleged invulnerability to death, which probably made would-be assassins think, challenge accepted. The emperor who once strutted into the arena believing himself a god was now peering nervously at doorknobs. At this point, Commodus wasn't ruling Rome, he was surviving it. Barely, and while he could crush slaves, threaten senators, and fire anyone who dared speak too loudly, he couldn't silence the whisper that kept circling through the alleys of the eternal city. What if we got rid of him? Commodus may have been emperor, but his grip was less iron fist and more sweaty palm. The empire was watching, knives were sharpening, and breakfast figs were looking increasingly judgmental. If there was a coin minted for every time Commodus made a financially irresponsible decision, Rome might have avoided economic collapse, ironically. Unfortunately, the emperor's economic strategy could be summarized as spend like Jupiter, think like Bacchus, and plan like a goat on fire. Under Commodus, Rome's economy didn't just suffer, it spiraled, groaned, and wept openly as the emperor made it rain denarii on whatever caught his eye, which was usually himself. Let's start with the basics. Rome's imperial budget was always a delicate dance between military expenses, infrastructure, administrative upkeep, and not going bankrupt. But Commodus looked at the imperial coffers like they were his personal piggy bank with no bottom and no consequences. He inherited a reasonably stable economy from his father, Marcus Aurelius, who, despite facing plagues and wars, didn't consider daily lion shows and self-worshipping parades a line item on the budget. Commodus did. One of his first economic indulgences, gladiatorial games. And not just any games, extravaganzas. He wasn't content with a few combatants duking it out for public amusement. No, Commodus's games lasted for months. He had hundreds, even thousands of exotic animals shipped in from across the empire. Tigers from India, hippos from Egypt, ostriches from wherever ostriches come from. Then he killed them personally in the arena, dressed as Hercules, in front of tens of thousands. Rome loved a good show until they realized they were footing the bill. But wait, there's more. Gladiators weren't just performing, they were being paid handsomely. Commodus himself fought in the arena, but not for free. He charged the empire enormous sums for every match he won. Spoiler alert, he always won. It turns out it's really easy to beat someone when the other guy is armed with a sponge and legally required to lose. According to ancient sources, Commodus demanded a fee of 1,000,000 sesterces per fight, and it's easy to see why the Roman treasury began hemorrhaging faster than a gladiator in his opening act. Then, there were the bribes. Commodus knew he wasn't exactly the people's choice, or the senate's, or the army's, or really anyone's, so he made up for it in coin. He lavished the Praetorian Guard with enormous payouts to secure their loyalty. Soldiers on the frontier got loyalty bonuses to stay quiet, and if a noble started grumbling, Commodus didn't silence them with a knife, not immediately. First, he tried hush money. All of this spending came with consequences, of course. The empire began to face rising inflation. With more and more coins being minted to cover the emperor's expenses, the value of currency dropped. Prices for grain, oil, and other daily necessities soared, which might have mattered more to Commodus if he'd ever bought his own groceries. But when you live in a marble palace with heated baths and an entourage of peacocks, price hikes aren't really on your radar. To offset the growing deficit, Commodus began selling public offices. Want to be a governor? Sure, just bring a sack of gold. Want to oversee the grain supply? Hope you have a rich uncle. This corruption undermined the already fragile bureaucracy and meant that idiots with deep pockets were now running entire provinces. It was like turning the DMV over to a group of toddlers with toy swords and a sugar high. Worse still, when funds ran truly low, Commodus did what any economically illiterate tyrant might do. He cut essential services. The grain dole, Rome's version of food stamps, saw reductions. Infrastructure projects stalled. Pay for frontier troops became irregular. The aqueducts still ran, but everything else began to creak. Riots weren't far behind. When citizens can't afford bread, and the guy on top is parading around in lion skins talking about how he's Hercules, things start to feel unstable. And perhaps most ironically of all, Commodus built statues of himself as a bringer of prosperity. In one particularly tone-deaf example, he had coins minted showing himself as the restorer of the Roman economy. Meanwhile, senators were pawning their togas, and the provinces were literally revolting, economically and emotionally. By the end of his reign, Rome's once proud treasury looked more like a theater's backstage, disorganized, over budget, and smelling faintly of fear and goat sweat. The empire wasn't quite bankrupt, not yet, but the warning signs were there, glowing red and screaming in Latin. In short, Commodus's policy was simple: spend everything, bribe everyone, and die before the receipts are due. It worked for a while, until it didn't. For years, Commodus surrounded himself with human echo chambers, people who knew their job was to nod enthusiastically, clap when told, and pretend that renaming Rome after your own ego was a genius move. But as with most self-centered emperors with a flair for theater and a passion for murder, the drama eventually turned inward. Commodus's closest allies, the people who used to oil his ego and maybe his gladiator armor, started asking themselves a dangerous question. Do I want to die next Tuesday because he had a bad dream? Turns out the answer was no. Let's start with Marcia, Commodus's longtime mistress, and one of the few people who could occasionally speak to him like he was something other than a divine lion-murdering man-child. She had power, she had influence, and unfortunately, she also had a place on a kill list. Yes, sometime in late 192 AD, Commodus, either in a rage, a paranoid fit, or after misinterpreting his horoscope, compiled a death list of people who had displeased him. Names included top-ranking officials, a few senators, and awkwardly Marcia herself. It was the kind of list that would make Santa Claus reconsider his own methods, and when a copy of it accidentally or fatefully fell into Marcia's hands, She skipped right past "let's talk it out" and went straight to "let's poison this lunatic." Now it's worth pausing here to remember that Commodus had made himself practically untouchable. The Senate was cowed, the military had been bought off, and the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite imperial bodyguards, had so much hush money funneled into their pockets that they practically jingled when they walked. But something had shifted. Commodus had become unstable in a way that even his closest supporters could no longer ignore. He talked about massacring the Senate. He wanted to march into the new year dressed as a gladiator god emperor and declare himself consul again with zero political support. His behavior wasn't just tyrannical, it was suicidal, and nobody wanted front row seats to that kind of finale. So Marcia teamed up with Latus, the Praetorian prefect, aka the guy in charge of Commodus's own security detail, and Eclectus, the palace chamberlain. Think of them as the Roman imperial version of a workplace HR complaint, except with more poison and fewer mediators. Their first attempt was classic Roman subtlety, a poisoned glass of wine served up after Commodus's daily spar and strangle routine. He drank it, everyone waited, and nothing. Maybe the poison was weak. Maybe Commodus had developed an immunity from all those questionable arena snacks. Or maybe even death needed a moment to wrap its head around this guy. So plan B, send in a professional strangler. They called in Narcissus, a wrestling partner and personal trainer to Commodus, because if you're going to commit regicide, you might as well get someone who knows how to pin a man without leaving fingerprints. Narcissus allegedly entered the emperor's chamber, possibly while Commodus was groggy from the wine or mid-bath, and strangled him to death. And just like that, Rome's most theatrical emperor was no more. The man who renamed cities after himself, fought in the Colosseum like it was CrossFit, and made paranoia an Olympic sport, had been outmaneuvered not by a legion but by a fitness coach and a furious girlfriend. The aftermath was swift and a little awkward. The Senate, which had spent the last decade clapping nervously while pretending everything was fine, suddenly found its spine. They declared Commodus a public enemy. His statues were torn down. His name was scratched out of public records. His legacy, already a disaster, was scrubbed like a bad tattoo. Even the Colonia Commodiana signs got yanked down faster than a clearance sale banner. As for Marcia, Latus, and Eclectus, well, their victory was short-lived. Power vacuums in Rome were dangerous places, and the people who killed emperors didn't always get a happy retirement. Within months, all three were dead too, victims of the chaos that Commodus had spent years cultivating like a really toxic garden. But in the end, the fall of Commodus was poetic in its own grim, gladiatorial way. He'd lived as a performer, demanded loyalty like a toddler in a crown, and treated Rome like a theatre set for his own private drama. And when the final curtain fell, it wasn't the Senate, or a rival general, or the gods who brought him down. It was his inner circle, the very people who once clapped the loudest. And somewhere in the afterlife, Marcus Aurelius probably sighed so hard it started a breeze in the underworld. Commodus had always believed he would die a god, adored by the masses, his muscles glistening under divine sunlight, while celestial choirs applauded from Olympus. Reality had other plans, and those plans involved a bathhouse, some poison that couldn't do its job, and a fed-up wrestler named Narcissus, who didn't get paid enough for this nonsense. By the time 192 AD limped toward its end, Commodus had alienated just about everyone not actively on his payroll. His court had transformed into a paranoid circle of sycophants clinging to the edge of madness, and Rome was groaning under the weight of economic ruin, political chaos, and second-hand embarrassment. Even his mistress, Marcia, the woman who had once been his closest confidante, was now keeping one eye on the emperor and the other on the exits, and she had good reason. Commodus had grown increasingly erratic, threatening mass executions, including Marcia herself, several senators, and basically anyone who looked too serious at breakfast. One day he announced a grand New Year's plan. He would assume full consulship dressed as a gladiator, turning the highest office in Rome into a cosplay festival. For Marcia and the Praetorian Guard, This was the final straw. Rome couldn't take another year of this toga-wrapped disaster, so the conspiracy was formed. It wasn't subtle. It didn't need to be. The inner circle included Marcia, Aemilius Latus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, and Eclectus, the chamberlain. They decided the best time to kill a man was when he wasn't wearing pants. That's not a proverb. That's literally how it went down. Step 1. Poison his dinner. Marcia slipped the deadly dose into his beef, or maybe it was his wine. Sources differ, but either way the poison was meant to do the job quietly. Unfortunately, Commodus had the iron stomach of a circus bear and survived it, vomiting most of it up like a bad party guest refusing to leave. Plan A had failed. Time for Plan B. Send in the wrestler. Enter Narcissus. A professional athlete and one of Commodus's own fitness trainers, Narcissus had seen the emperor in his most ridiculous moments flexing in lion skins, pretending to be Hercules and shadow boxing in the mirror. On this particular evening, Narcissus received a new assignment. Don't spot the emperor during squats. Strangle him. Commodus, likely weakened from the poison but still alive and floundering around in his bath, didn't stand much of a chance. Narcissus entered, grappled the would-be god and choked him to death in the damp silence of a palace bathroom. The man who demanded worship as a living deity died in the most mortal, undignified way imaginable, half naked and surrounded by the echo of dripping water. It was December 31st, 1902 AD. Rome rang in the new year with something it hadn't felt in years: collective relief. The Senate, who had spent the past decade groveling under threat of beheading or spontaneous humiliation, practically threw a party. Commodus's statues were torn down. His name was erased from monuments. All the months he'd renamed after himself swiftly returned to their boring, sensible titles. January became January again, not Lucius Aelius Aurelius Commodus Augustus, month of perpetual brilliance. In death, Commodus received the kind of treatment reserved for history's least loved leaders. His body wasn't honored, it was quietly buried. The city sighed. The empire tried to reset, but the damage was already done, because the thing is, Commodus didn't just die. He left a legacy of disaster behind. His assassination didn't fix Rome. It merely kicked off a new chapter of instability, known as the Year of the Five Emperors. But for a fleeting moment, as dawn rose on the first day of 1903 AD, Rome felt a strange and unfamiliar emotion: hope. Commodus had ruled like a narcissistic fever dream come to life, and now the dream had ended, violently, unceremoniously, and in the most un-Herculean manner possible. Turns out, history doesn't favor emperors who insist on renaming sandwiches after themselves. Commodus wanted to be a god. Instead, he got erased like a bad X from Rome's imperial yearbook. His reign ended not with thunderous applause, but with a suspiciously silent mourning in the palace and one very dead emperor in the bath. And what followed? Well, imagine a political system duct-taped together by fear suddenly realizing the duct tape has melted. Spoiler alert, things got very, very messy. The Senate, having spent over a decade groveling through gritted teeth, wasted zero time pretending they'd never heard of Commodus. Enter Damnatio Memoria, Rome's delete key for disgraced emperors. His statues? Smashed. His name? Chiseled off monuments. His coins? Reminted like embarrassing misprints. It was history's most aggressive unfriending. If Commodus had Instagram, the whole empire would have blocked him overnight. It wasn't just personal, it was strategic. The Senate needed to scrub Commodus out of the narrative to restore their own credibility. Who? Commodus. Oh, that Commodus. No relation. Never heard of him. Anyway, long live the Republic or Empire. It was the equivalent of a country waking up from a 12-year bad dream, only to realize they were now standing on the edge of a cliff, blindfolded, and someone had just whispered, "Jump." Because while the man was gone, his chaos was not. Commodus hadn't left behind a stable line of succession. He hadn't groomed a capable heir. What he had left was a giant power vacuum, a nervous military, an exhausted Senate, and a treasury that had been milked harder than a Roman goat. The year following his death would become known as the Year of the Five Emperors, a title that sounds impressive until you realize none of them lasted very long. The first contestant in this deadly game of imperial musical chairs was Pertinax, a respected senator with a background in actual governance. Imagine that. He lasted 3 months. Why? Because he tried to restore discipline to the Praetorian Guard, the same folks who had just helped off Commodus. Spoiler, they didn't appreciate the new management style, so they stabbed him, brutally, on the palace steps. So much for trying to clean up the empire. Next up, Didius Julianus, a man who literally bought the empire at auction, the Praetorian Guard, proving once again they were less elite protectors and more armed eBay, sold the throne to the highest bidder. Julianus outbid his competitors and promptly found himself in charge of a city that absolutely hated him. Rome's version of you break it, you buy it. He lasted just 9 weeks before getting his head chopped off by the next guy. And so it went. Emperors rising and falling like bad opening acts before the main event. The empire, once the envy of the world, was now essentially hosting a live-action remake of Survivor Roman Edition. The legions, no longer loyal to Rome itself, started backing their own generals for emperor, not out of love for the empire, but because they wanted someone who'd pay them on time and not feed them to lions. Fair, really. Civil war erupted as regional armies clashed over who got to sit on the increasingly cursed imperial throne. Each contender promised stability, peace, and glory. Most delivered bloodshed, paranoia, and the occasional beheading. Rome hadn't seen this much turnover since the invention of the toga. Through it all, the shadow of Commodus loomed large. His narcissistic rule had gutted the imperial institutions, humiliated the Senate, bloated the military with bribes, and drained the economy. He had turned government into theater, military into a bribe club, and leadership into a one-man vanity project. Rome's golden age, Pax Romana, had ended not with a noble struggle, but with a guy in a lion's skin clubbing a giraffe in front of a paying audience. Even future emperors like Septimius Severus couldn't fully escape Commodus's stink. Severus eventually had to re-legitimize Commodus posthumously to curry favor with certain factions, because even in death, Commodus remained the empire's most problematic brand. Historians later debated just how much of the collapse was Commodus's fault, but one thing was clear: his reign had broken the illusion of imperial invincibility. The empire survived him, but only just. His death marked a turning point, where emperors became expendable, armies became kingmakers, and the empire itself began its long, slow crumble toward medieval obscurity. So here lies Commodus, a man who saw himself as Hercules reborn, but left behind a legacy of blood, marble dust, and a shredded economy. Not bad for a guy who once renamed a month after himself. In the end, he didn't just die in the bathroom, he flushed an empire down with him. Before we talk about Napoleon getting curb-stomped by a herd of overly friendly rabbits, we need to talk about the man himself, because you can't appreciate the irony of one of history's greatest military minds being undone by what was essentially a surprise cuddle ambush, unless you first understand just how ridiculously competent and controlling Napoleon Bonaparte truly was. Napoleon wasn't born into greatness. He was born in 1769, on the island of Corsica, just a year after it was taken over by France. Basically, imagine being born in the middle of a corporate acquisition. You're French now, deal with it. As a result, young Napoleon grew up with a chip on his shoulder the size of a cannonball. He spoke French with a Corsican accent, was bullied in school, and spent his youth furiously reading military theory, while other kids were learning how to socialize without using artillery metaphors. And while most teenagers were dealing with acne and awkwardness, Napoleon was out here becoming a lieutenant by 16 and casually studying how to conquer nations like someone skimming over IKEA instructions. By 24, he had already crushed a royalist uprising in Paris using a whiff of grape shot, which is just a poetic way of saying he turned angry mobs into mist with cannons. Good morning, revolution. But Napoleon wasn't just good at war. He was a tactical nightmare for his enemies. He made a habit of winning battles he absolutely should have lost. Outnumbered? Good. Outgunned? Even better. Fighting 3 armies before breakfast? Just another Tuesday. Take the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, also known as the Battle of 3 Emperors. Napoleon faced off against the combined forces of Russia and Austria, and not only beat them, but beat them so badly the Austrian emperor basically ghosted him afterward. Napoleon didn't just win, he rearranged the entire balance of European power and made his enemies look like they'd accidentally brought spoons to a sword fight. And here's the thing, Napoleon wasn't the kind of commander who sat back and let his generals handle things. Oh no, he micromanaged everything. Troop formations, battlefield positioning, supply lines, even the exact placement of cannons. If Napoleon could have physically moved the soldiers himself like living chess pieces, he would have. He was the boss who shows up on the battlefield at 3 a.m. to make sure the tent flaps are symmetrical. But it didn't stop at warfare. No. Napoleon also wanted control over society, law, and even how people dressed. Ever heard of the Napoleonic Code? That was his brainchild. It was a complete overhaul of the legal system designed to make French law easier to understand and apply, unless of course you were trying to argue against something Napoleon wanted. Then it was more like a very polite legal bulldozer. He even had a hand in food logistics. When his army started getting cranky about starving between victories, he offered a cash prize to anyone who could come up with a better food preservation method. This eventually led to canned food. That's right. Next time you crack open a can of beans, thank Napoleon for not wanting his army to die of hunger before they got shot. And yes, he was short, technically. At 5'6" or 5'7" by modern standards, he was actually average height for his time. The Napoleon was tiny myth mostly came from British propaganda and cartoons that liked drawing him next to impossibly tall guards for comedic effect. He wasn't small, he was just poorly illustrated. But his personality, that was enormous. Napoleon didn't just conquer nations, he rebranded Europe. He crowned himself emperor in 1804, which was basically the 19th century equivalent of saying, "I don't need your promotion, I'll promote myself." During the ceremony, the Pope came all the way from Rome to crown him, and Napoleon just grabbed the crown and put it on his own head like a bossy toddler at a birthday party. He wanted control over everything, not just his armies and empire, but down to the cut of military jackets and the style of marching music. You couldn't just exist in Napoleon's world, you had to exist precisely on time and preferably at attention. He once told a subordinate, "If you want a thing done well, do it yourself," which is inspirational until you realize he meant literally everything. By the early 1800s, Napoleon had either defeated, intimidated, or married into nearly every major power in Europe. His empire stretched from Spain to the edge of Russia. The man redrew the map of Europe and then redrew it again because he didn't like the first draft. He was so powerful that even when exiled to Elba, he came back. He literally escaped his island prison, returned to France, and people greeted him like a rock star. Not a shot fired, just cheers and awe. So yes, this was the man. A hyper-focused, obsessive, brilliant force of nature. A man who looked at Europe and saw a very large to-do list. The guy who didn't believe in luck, only in logistics and artillery. And that's why what happens next is so deliciously absurd, because a man who defeated kings, emperors and coalitions was about to face the only force he was never prepared for, a carpet of adorable food-motivated rabbits. Stay tuned. This gets wildly fluffy. Napoleon Bonaparte, fresh off bulldozing half of Europe into submission, was ready to party, and when you're the Emperor of the French, supreme military commander, law reformer, and all-around scourge of monarchies, you don't just book a nice restaurant and call it a day. No, when Napoleon celebrates, the guest list includes generals, aristocrats, diplomats, and apparently a few thousand unsuspecting rabbits. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, we have to understand the vibe. It's 1807, and Napoleon has just brokered the Treaty of Tilsit, a diplomatic flex so massive it practically left a crater in the European power balance. France and Russia were now best frenemies, and Prussia had been reduced to the geopolitical equivalent of a sad trombone. Napoleon had carved up Central Europe with a flick of his quill, and naturally it was time for champagne and cannon fire. Now, when most people think post-war celebration, they think medals, speeches, maybe a parade with some slightly off-tempo marching. But this is Napoleon we're talking about. The man didn't do subtle. He once celebrated the conquest of Vienna by hosting an opera performance in Vienna, like a house guest who redecorates your living room while you're still sitting in it. In his mind, nothing said victory quite like organizing a symbolic hunting party, a throwback to the aristocratic traditions of Europe's old nobility. Hunting wasn't just recreation back then, it was a flex. Kings, dukes, and emperors had been using organized hunts for centuries to show off their wealth, land, and raw dominance over both nature and anyone without a title. Napoleon, who by now had crowned himself emperor and was making a hobby of redefining tradition, thought, "Perfect, let's do that, but bigger, fancier, Frencher." So Napoleon ordered a rabbit hunt. Not just any rabbit hunt, a grand imperial rabbit hunt. It was meant to be part military exercise, part outdoor entertainment, and part diplomatic theatre. You see, by this point, Napoleon wasn't just fighting wars, he was performing power. Every banquet, parade, and yes, even hunting event was carefully staged political theatre with muskets, and this one, it was set to be a spectacle. He handed the job of organizing the festivities to Alexandre Berthier, his chief of staff and longtime logistical wizard. Berthier was the kind of man who could coordinate an army of 200,000 and still make time to alphabetize the cannonballs. If Napoleon was the lightning bolt, Berthier was the grounding wire. He made Napoleon's grandiose plans physically happen, whether that meant ferrying troops across frozen rivers or arranging the right number of forks for a military dinner in a field tent. So Berthier, ever the diligent middle manager of empire, got to work. The event would be held on a lush estate just outside Paris. The nobles were invited, the guns were polished, the weather was perfect, and the wine was naturally French and flowing. All Napoleon had to do was show up, shoot a few symbolic bunnies, and bask in the praise of diplomats who were too afraid to comment on his increasingly dramatic hat collection. Here's where things start to drift from reality into what can only be described as Looney Tunes with a budget. Berthier, wanting to make sure the emperor's big day went off without a hitch, decided to preload the battlefield. You see, wild rabbits are unpredictable, wily, and worst of all, disobedient to imperial scheduling. Berthier's solution: order hundreds, possibly thousands of domesticated rabbits from local farms and release them just before the hunt began. That way the rabbits would be right where the hunters needed them, conveniently placed, photogenic, and hopefully too polite to run too far. In fairness, it made sense on paper. The problem, of course, is that paper does not account for what happens when you release thousands of confused, hungry bunnies in front of a group of armed men expecting wild prey. But we'll get there in due time. For now, just picture the pre-hunt scene. Napoleon standing in the sun-dappled fields of France, surrounded by loyal officers in full regalia, a glass of Bordeaux in one hand and a custom musket in the other, about to enjoy a post-diplomatic moment of aristocratic leisure. There's polite laughter, polite applause, polite anxiety. Rabbits hop gently through the grass, looking like extras in a painting by Watteau. It is a scene painted for propaganda, meticulously arranged to show Napoleon not just as a conqueror, but as a man of taste, refinement, and effortless control. It's almost perfect. Almost. The hunting party is ready. The guns are lifted. The rabbits are in position. The stage is set for an emperor to show he commands not only men and nations, but nature itself. And then, the rabbits charge. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. The point is, Napoleon, flush with victory, staged an elite celebration meant to project the image of total mastery. A hunt was chosen, a symbol of dominion over the wild, of imperial majesty, of classical strength, and instead it became a farce that would haunt his legacy like a fluffy hopping ghost. There are logistical errors, And then there's accidentally summoning a rabbit-based uprising against the Emperor of France. What was meant to be a meticulously organized hunting party turned into a cuddly ambush thanks to one man, Alexandre Berthier, chief of staff, master of military minutiae, and on this one very memorable day, accidental architect of Napoleon's fluffiest failure. Now, to be fair, Berthier was no fool. In fact, Berthier was the guy who could coordinate the movement of hundreds of thousands of troops across multiple countries without inventing spreadsheets. He was Napoleon's go-to man for keeping the empire's war machine purring like a well-fed artillery cat. If Napoleon was the flaming sword of conquest, Berthier was the clipboard. And not just any clipboard, the golden clipboard of doom, held by a man who could get a cavalry regiment to Vienna with nothing but a napkin and a compass. So when the boss wanted a grand hunting spectacle, Berthier delivered. But this wasn't a hunt in the traditional sense. This wasn't some duke sneaking through the forest in tweed trying to spot a deer. This was a performance, and Berthier knew it. He had to guarantee that the emperor would have an easy, flawless, photogenic hunt, one where the rabbits cooperated, the shots were perfect, and the assembled dignitaries would return home saying, "You know, that Napoleon fellow sure does know how to kill a bunny with grace and flair." But there was a problem. Wild rabbits are extremely uncooperative. They do inconvenient things like run, hide, or, heaven forbid, act like wild animals. And that would simply not do. What if Napoleon missed a shot? What if the rabbits didn't appear on cue? What if, gasp, he got his boots muddy chasing one? Berthier decided to outsmart nature. His answer? Don't bother with wild rabbits at all, just order tame ones, domesticated rabbits. The kind raised on farms, used to humans, used to being fed, cute, soft, well-mannered bundles of fluff that could be gently placed near the hunters, and ideally sit still long enough to be theatrically hunted. And when Berthier did something, he did it thoroughly. He didn't just send someone to collect a few dozen rabbits from a nearby village. No. Berthier went full Easter Bunny warehouse clearance mode. He ordered hundreds, possibly even thousands of rabbits. Reports vary, but some estimates go as high as 3,000. That's not a rabbit hunt. That's a furry land invasion. Now imagine being the local farmers who received this order. You raise rabbits for meat or fur, and suddenly a messenger from the emperor shows up demanding every single bunny you've got because the most powerful man in Europe wants a charming afternoon. The response was probably something like, how many do you need? Followed by several days of rabbit collection, frantic coop building, and at least one existential crisis about serving an emperor who needed this many rodents to feel fulfilled. The rabbits were rounded up, boxed, carted in, and strategically stored until the big moment. It was, in theory, brilliant. The hunting ground was a carefully prepared field just outside Paris, decorated like a battlefield designed by Disney. Rolling grass, clear skies, trimmed hedges, and an ominous silence that would later be explained by the sheer volume of rabbits calculating their next move. This wasn't just a logistical task, it was a choreographed production. The rabbits had to be released at the right moment, spread evenly across the area, and ideally look wild enough to pass as fair game while still being tame enough not to, do anything weird, like, say, stage a full frontal assault. But therein lay the fatal flaw. Domesticated rabbits aren't afraid of humans, quite the opposite. They see people as a source of food. These bunnies weren't raised to flee at the sound of boots or gunfire. They were raised to associate men with carrots, so instead of running when released, these rabbits saw Napoleon and his elaborately dressed entourage and thought, finally the snack vendors have arrived. Berthier, so used to calculating troop formations and artillery logistics, had failed to account for the psychological complexity of barnyard animals. He could plan an invasion of Italy down to the last bootlace, but he didn't know that releasing 1,000 hungry rabbits in front of the most powerful man in Europe was basically loading a cannon with chaos and lighting the fuse with a baguette. No one raised a hand to question this. Who was going to second-guess Berthier, the emperor's right-hand man? "Ah, sir, I think this is too many rabbits. is not a sentence you say unless you're ready to be transferred to Siberia, or worse, forced to explain yourself directly to Napoleon while being pelted with decorative bread rolls. And so, the hunting grounds were set, the bunnies were boxed and ready, twitchy little noses pressed against crates, not knowing they were about to become part of one of history's weirdest anecdotes. Berthier, proud of his rabbit acquisition efforts, likely dusted off his hands and looked over the green fields with satisfaction. The emperor would be pleased. The hunt would be a grand success. The rabbits were docile. The field was perfect. And the champagne was already chilled. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, Berthier. Everything. It started as most disasters do, with high hopes and good weather. Napoleon Bonaparte arrived at the grand hunting grounds outside Paris, dressed not for war, but for pageantry. He was surrounded by a hand-picked entourage of generals, noblemen, diplomats, and probably one or two unlucky interns holding extra ammunition and decorative baguettes. The sun was shining, the wine was flowing, the fields rolled out before them like a royal painting, and somewhere thousands of rabbits were waiting. The goal of the day was simple, a quick, clean hunt, followed by a classy post-victory lunch. It was meant to be the final brushstroke in a masterpiece of military and social dominance. The Treaty of Tilsit had just been signed, and Europe was temporarily quiet, a rare chance for Napoleon to put down his sword and pick up a sporting musket. But the moment the crates opened, all illusions of civility collapsed like a souffle in a thunderstorm. At first, it was just a few rabbits, hopping out into the open, sniffing the air, twitching their noses. Innocent, fluffy, almost poetic. Napoleon likely smiled, musket ready, prepared to show that he could dominate nature just as thoroughly as he dominated foreign policy. And then the flood began. From every direction they came, hundreds, possibly thousands, brown ones, white ones, spotted ones, a bouncing furry tide of ears and paws, storming across the field in what can only be described as the most adorable charge in military history. Only they weren't running away as rabbits typically do when faced with gun-toting humans. They were running toward. That's when people started to realize something was wrong. Not just wrong, absurd. What was supposed to be a hunt had instantly mutated into something more closely resembling a siege, with the prey storming the castle gates. Eyewitnesses. Yes, this is the kind of event that has eyewitnesses. Later described the scene with the kind of confused horror typically reserved for alien invasions or experimental theater. Rabbits began climbing boots, hopping into laps, leaping into carriages, and generally treating the emperor's elite like a mobile buffet. Napoleon, standing at the front, was the prime target. He tried shooing them off. He tried waving his riding crop. Some accounts say he even swatted a few away, presumably while shouting something historically unprintable in French. But it was no use. The rabbits, tame, domesticated, and extremely accustomed to being fed by humans, had identified the party as walking lunchboxes. To them, this wasn't a hunt. It was feeding time at the bunny buffet. The Emperor of France, who had survived cannon fire, Russian winters, and Austrian diplomacy, now found himself overwhelmed by rabbits so eager they could have carried menus. One by one his entourage broke formation. Some tried fleeing, others tried kicking their way through the oncoming tide. Horses reared, carriages rocked, and muskets designed for open battlefields were about as useful as a feather in a pillow fight. There were no orders, no formations, just panicked men in lace-trimmed coats trying to out-hop the hoppers. Napoleon himself was forced into a tactical retreat, not a metaphorical one, a literal boots-in-the-dirt, flee-for-your-silk-lined life retreat. He ran, or more accurately, was helped into his carriage as rabbits began climbing onto the wheels. Some even tried to follow him inside. Picture it, the most feared man in Europe, slamming the carriage door against a wave of bunnies like he was trying to survive a zombie film rated PG. This was not the regal hunt he had envisioned. There were no dignified kills, no graceful shots, just chaos, unrelenting, ear-flopping, nose-wiggling chaos. Now, to be clear, no one died, not even the rabbits. There were no casualties save for pride, reputation, and the deeply shaken worldview of anyone who had previously believed in Napoleon's invincibility. This was a man who had crushed coalitions, rewritten constitutions, and recut maps like he was playing Risk with divine authority. And now here he was, defeated by a garden-level mammal with soft fur and the courage of a starving toddler at snack time. Some versions of the story claim the rabbits eventually tired out and wandered off. Others suggest that the entire party simply fled the field, leaving behind a confused, overfed bunny brigade, wondering why dessert never arrived. Regardless, the damage was done. The hunt was ruined. The emperor had been humbled, not by foreign troops, not by rebellious provinces, but by a miscalculation involving herbivorous mammals and poor event planning. The irony couldn't have been thicker if it had been served with a side of mustard, and while no official report of the incident exists in imperial dispatches, for obvious reasons, the story spread. Soldiers laughed behind closed doors, officers raised their eyebrows in polite disbelief, and somewhere in France, a farmer probably told his grandchildren, "Did I ever tell you about the time the rabbits nearly overthrew the French Empire?" When you picture Napoleon Bonaparte, you probably imagine a man atop a rearing stallion, saber in hand, roaring across a battlefield with the winds of destiny billowing behind his cloak. What you don't picture is that same man flailing a riding crop while screaming at a wave of aggressively adorable rabbits. But alas, history isn't always heroic. Sometimes it's hysterical. It all started with high hopes and sunny weather. Napoleon had come to the fields outside Paris expecting a picturesque hunting excursion, the kind where emperors fire a shot, sip some wine, and call it a day while aides fetch their trophies. He certainly didn't expect to be the prey, but sometimes when you stare down the enemy stares back and then hops directly at your face. As Napoleon and his entourage approached the carefully organized hunting grounds, Berthier's pride and joy lined with crates bursting at the hinges with domesticated rabbits. There was a brief moment of calm, the kind of stillness generals might describe before cannon fire. Napoleon adjusted his coat, surveyed the scene, and raised an eyebrow at the suspiciously cute targets twitching their noses in his direction. And then all hell broke loose. At the sound of the first released crate, the rabbits did not scatter like wild hares. No, these were domesticated bunnies, the kind raised on farms, used to humans, and especially used to being fed by humans. So when they saw a line of well-dressed Frenchmen holding shiny things that looked like food containers, or in their little rabbit minds, maybe oversized carrots, they charged. Not just a few. Hundreds, possibly thousands of rabbits came bounding out, ears flopping like banners of war, eyes glinting with the fury of the famished. Napoleon, at first, tried to maintain his dignity. Reports suggest he swatted a few with his riding crop, not in cruelty, but in escalating confusion. Picture the most powerful man in Europe, personally responsible for redrawing the map of the continent, now flapping at fuzzballs with the same panic your uncle uses when a pigeon enters the subway car. But the bunnies weren't deterred. If anything, the flailing seemed to embolden them. Rabbits began launching coordinated assaults on his boots. One allegedly climbed up his leg, clinging to his imperial uniform like a mountaineer summiting Everest. Another attempted to hop into his coat, possibly seeking either snacks or political asylum. Napoleon tried to reposition himself with all the decorum of a man not being swarmed by woodland creatures, but the illusion shattered quickly. Eyewitnesses described him spinning in circles, yelling at aides, and stomping in increasingly erratic patterns that, from a distance, may have resembled a panic dance-off. Berthier, somewhere nearby, was probably already rethinking his entire life's trajectory. As the assault intensified, Napoleon gave the order no one ever expected to hear in this context: retreat. He retreated not from Austrian battalions or Russian winter. No, this time he retreated from small mammals with twitchy noses and zero combat experience. And it wasn't just a polite exit. It was a full-on royal panic scramble. Napoleon made for his carriage like a man who had just discovered that bunnies were, in fact, the apex predator. The rabbits, sensing weakness, or maybe just still hoping for lunch, followed. Accounts suggest that some even tried to leap into the imperial carriage itself. Napoleon slammed the door shut, reportedly still brushing rabbit fur off his lapels, while the coachman cracked the reins like he was fleeing from invading cavalry. The rabbits won that day. They didn't just repel an invasion, they shattered the illusion of imperial control in the most adorable way possible. What's especially glorious about this moment is not just that Napoleon was defeated. Plenty of people tried to bring him down, most failed. But these rabbits? They didn't try. They didn't even know who he was, they just wanted snacks. And in their quest for lettuce or whatever snack rabbit dreams are made of, they accidentally performed the most successful act of psychological warfare in European history. No guns, no swords, just teeth, feet, and the stubborn optimism of animals that believed food was on the horizon and the emperor himself might have it in his pockets. The aftermath of this fluffy fiasco would linger longer in whispers than in official dispatches. After all, you don't write "we lost the day to rabbits" in your military journal unless you're ready for ridicule across 3 continents. But for one brief glorious moment, the Emperor of the French was brought low, not by armies or coalitions, but by a hopping, hungry, and heroically determined swarm of rabbits. It wasn't a battle, it was a bunny revolution, and Napoleon, he may have survived Waterloo, Elba, and the Russian tundra, but in the court of absurd historical defeats, the rabbits reigned supreme. Alexandre Berthier, Napoleon's chief of staff, was a man known for logistics. Need to move an army of 80,000 men across a continent with no GPS, limited food, and questionable hygiene? Berthier had you covered. He was the guy who knew how many cannonballs it took to make Vienna nervous, and how to stockpile enough bread to keep an army just shy of mutiny. He was, in short, the man Napoleon trusted to handle everything, which is why, when Napoleon casually suggested a hunting party to celebrate his diplomatic triumph at Tilsit, Berthier probably smiled and thought, easy, no armies, no horses, just rabbits. How hard could that be? Answer, catastrophically hard, but only if you ignore everything about how rabbits work. Let's start with the root of the disaster, Berthier's decision to purchase rabbits, not just a handful, but a veritable horde. Estimates range from a few hundred to as many as 3,000, instead of using wild rabbits who, as per tradition and basic instinct, run away when they see humans. Berthier sourced domesticated rabbits, probably from local farms, possibly from breeders who thought this was the most polite mass rabbit adoption in history. Domesticated rabbits, unlike their wild cousins, do not bolt at the sound of footsteps or gunfire. They do not scatter dramatically into the underbrush at the approach of cavalry. No, domesticated rabbits do one thing when they see people. They hop toward them. Why? Because humans mean food. It's that simple. Berthier, master of logistics, had accidentally created a cuddly feeding frenzy. Now picture it. Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who cowed monarchies and moved borders like chess pieces, steps out into a sunny field expecting to reenact the aristocratic pastime of the elite. His idea of a hunt probably included a few nobles sipping wine, firing in elegant poses, and then retiring with smug satisfaction, and a few rabbit pelts to brag about over dinner. What he got was the world's first documented reverse hunt. The prey hunted the hunters. And it wasn't even their fault. The rabbits weren't aggressive, they were enthusiastic. Imagine being a plump, farm-raised bunny who's lived your life associating people with carrots. Now imagine hundreds of you are released at once and see a field full of walking snack dispensers in shiny boots. The result? Bunny stampede. A joyful, relentless, toothless charge of confusion and fluff. Berthier, likely standing to the side with a proud smile, must have realized something was wrong when the prey started charging toward Napoleon like he was a buffet on horseback. That smile probably evaporated when the emperor began swatting rabbits away like he was fending off an invasion of plush toys with a stick. And when the imperial carriage became a last refuge from the advancing horde, that's the moment Berthier knew he'd made a career-altering mistake. Worse still, it was a psychological misread of epic proportions. Berthier had failed to account for rabbit behavior, a field of study not typically covered in Napoleonic military manuals. He didn't consult anyone about the basic instincts of lagomorphs. No peasant insights. No farmers pulled aside for a quick Q&A. He probably assumed all rabbits were alike and would act like proper woodland creatures, panicked, elusive, and obliging enough to die on cue. Instead, he brought in what amounted to the livestock equivalent of a catered event, one where the guests mistake you for the entree. Historians rarely focus on the aftermath, but one can imagine the tension that followed. Did Berthier apologize profusely? Did he offer to organize a second, proper hunt, one without the risk of fluff-induced humiliation? Did he, perhaps, spend the evening practicing how to say "I resign" in increasingly distant dialects of French? To be fair, Berthier would go on to serve Napoleon faithfully for years after this. So either Napoleon had a sense of humor, or he simply accepted the day as one of life's occasional humiliating curveballs. Either way, Berthier got incredibly lucky that the rabbits hadn't also eaten his job. But let this stand as a warning to party planners of all centuries. Know your animals, understand your guests, and under no circumstances should you mix elite military leaders with farm-raised rabbits, unless you're prepared for the cuddliest mutiny in European history. Berthier might have won battles on parchment, but in the end, he lost the war of common sense to a group of fluffy freeloaders. Napoleon Bonaparte, conqueror of Europe, reformer of France, man who could silence generals with a stare, had just suffered one of history's fluffiest defeats. And while the world didn't exactly grind to a halt after the Great Bunny Uprising of 1807, let's just say the event left a poor-shaped dent in the emperor's dignity. This was no Waterloo. The empire did not crumble. No throne was abdicated. But something in Napoleon's perfectly poised self-image took a nibble that day, and the whispers afterward proved it. Let's be clear. Napoleon didn't issue a formal military report on the engagement with lagomorph forces. There were no battle maps drawn with arrows tracing the bunny charge. No medals awarded for courage under carrot assault. Instead, silence was the official policy. Napoleon was never one for dwelling on embarrassment, and this incident certainly wasn't making the cut for his personal memoirs. Imagine opening the memoirs of the emperor to find a chapter titled, Chapter 13, My Encounter with the Hopping Horde. Still, the lack of documentation didn't mean the event vanished. In the days following the incident, those in Napoleon's close circle knew better than to bring it up. But outside the tight loop of advisors and boot polishers, the story started to hop its way through the court. In the imperial court, where powdered wigs and polished boots met bottomless egos and endless boredom, gossip was a survival skill. The aristocracy, forced to smile and bow through endless protocol, found immense pleasure in one thing: watching powerful people trip over their own pride. So naturally, when word trickled out that the man who made Austria beg for peace had been chased off a field by a crowd of long-eared peasants with whiskers, it became irresistible material. No one dared laugh openly, of course, at least not while Napoleon was within earshot, but behind closed doors, the snickering echoed like musket fire at Austerlitz. "Did you hear?" someone would whisper in a salon. "The emperor took up hunting. The prey took him up instead." The tale was passed around in hushed tones, retold with increasing dramatic flair. Some said the rabbits chewed through his boots. Others swore one tried to climb into his hat. Every retelling added a new exaggeration. And soon Napoleon was portrayed less like a seasoned emperor and more like a flustered farmer at a bunny infestation. It's not that Napoleon didn't have a sense of humor. He just preferred jokes where he was the punchline's author, not its subject. When whispers reached his ears, he likely responded with the classic imperial deadpan, a raised eyebrow, a long, hard stare that made the joker wish they'd taken up knitting instead of banter. But despite his best efforts to control the narrative, even emperors can't fully suppress comedy born from chaos. Rather than retaliate, Napoleon did what many powerful men in history have done when faced with an unflattering moment. He ignored it into oblivion. Berthier, the well-meaning chief of staff responsible for the fur-fueled fiasco, wasn't fired or exiled. Napoleon was a pragmatist. If he punished every blunder, there wouldn't be enough high-ranking men left to run the army. Besides, Berthier had served loyally for years. One bunny-related slip-up, while memorable, didn't outweigh his decades of competence. Though let's be honest, he was probably never asked to organize a picnic again. Strangely, this bizarre blip in Napoleonic history didn't come to full public light until much later, when military historians and curious biographers started digging into anecdotal records and memoirs from members of the imperial court. It wasn't until the 20th century that the tale gained traction as one of the strangest footnotes in all of European military lore. And yet in hindsight it's oddly fitting. Napoleon, for all his brilliance and bombast, was still human. A man who once crowned himself emperor in front of the Pope was equally capable of being blindsided by a stampede of snack-seeking fluffballs. It serves as a perfect reminder that history's great figures, no matter how gilded by textbooks, are always one absurd event away from becoming the punchline in a very strange story. In the end, Napoleon continued his reign, fought more wars, redrew more borders, and left a legacy that would echo through history. But tucked away in the archives, beside maps of campaigns and political treaties, lies a lesser-known moment, a spring afternoon when the Emperor of France lost control, not to a foreign army, but to an army of hungry rabbits. No statues were built for them, no bunny-shaped Medal of Honor was struck, but their legacy, it endures, quietly, hopping through the pages of history like it owns the place. There are moments in history that echo through the ages. Caesar crossing the Rubicon, the storming of the Bastille, the moon landing, and then there's the time Napoleon Bonaparte was ambushed by a horde of fluffy, mildly confused rabbits. This peculiar footnote didn't just survive, it thrived. While the emperor himself may have preferred it be lost in the fog of war, or at least in the tall grass of historical forgetfulness, the tale lived on through the ink-stained pages of letters, memoirs, and eventually the internet's collective sense of humor. Let's begin with the sources. While official Napoleonic records, unsurprisingly, don't have a section titled Operation Bunny Blitz, the event slipped into history through first-hand accounts from those present. Several memoirs and private letters from members of Napoleon's staff describe the incident, in tones that range from baffled amusement to subtle panic. In particular, contemporary French chroniclers noted the oddity of the emperor's hunting expedition being, shall we say, interrupted by unexpected enthusiasm from the wildlife. That's diplomatic code for the rabbits turned feral. Of course, the 19th century wasn't exactly known for its viral content. There was no TikTok video of Napoleon running from a swarm of fluff, no trending hashtag Rabbitgate. But word spread through salons, military gossip circles, and drawing rooms across Europe. The image of Europe's most feared commander waving his riding crop at overfed bunnies became a favorite anecdote among aristocrats who had a bone to pick with the empire. It wasn't battlefield defeat, it was comic relief, and that kind of story sticks. Historians didn't forget either. While the Napoleonic Wars have spawned entire libraries of dense academic tomes analyzing military tactics, economic effects, and geopolitical shifts, every now and then a historian can't resist adding a little Easter egg, literally. In footnotes, sidebars, or entire humorous essays, scholars have kept the bunny incident alive. It regularly pops up in compilations of history's strangest events, often sandwiched between tales of Pope Gregory IX excommunicating cats and the time a British MP died from a flying turnip. As the centuries wore on, the story adapted itself to new formats. It moved from dusty documents to trivia books, dinner party conversations, and eventually the digital age. Online forums ask, did Napoleon really get attacked by rabbits? Creators dramatize the moment with dramatically swelling music and slow-motion bunny charges. Memes float around captioned with things like, "When you're ready to conquer the world, but the world sends rabbits." What makes this story endure isn't just its absurdity, it's its humanity. Napoleon, the man of ambition, power, and ego, was also just a guy who wanted to celebrate with a nice hunt and ended up being mildly traumatized by puffballs. It's the kind of historical hiccup that reminds us emperors are not infallible. They're just as vulnerable to a miscalculated animal encounter as the rest of us. The tale also scratches that deliciously ironic itch. How poetic that the man who outmaneuvered Austria, Prussia and Russia was undone, for one sunny afternoon, by a miscommunication between his chief of staff and a rabbit supplier. There's also something timelessly satisfying about a story where nature takes the lead and history's usual script is flipped. Typically, animals in war are the background players: war horses, messenger pigeons, elephants with armor. But here, they were the main act. They weren't conscripted. They just showed up, did what rabbits do, run toward food, and inadvertently gave the emperor a memory he'd never quite lived down. And unlike political defeats or military disasters, this one doesn't carry the weight of bloodshed, just bruised dignity and possibly chewed boots. In the grand opera of Napoleon's life, this event was no more than a comic intermezzo, a brief moment where the curtain slipped and the farce showed through the drama. But precisely because it was so minor, it has survived with all its charm intact. While Austerlitz and Waterloo are taught in classrooms, the rabbit incident is whispered like a historical inside joke, one with staying power. And let's be honest, in an age where every second of history is scrutinized, re-evaluated, and debated, the image of Napoleon retreating from a cavalry of cottontails is a rare moment of universally accepted delight. No one's arguing over strategy, intent, or political impact. Everyone's just enjoying the mental picture. In the grand halls of European history, between the treaties that redrew borders and the battles that toppled empires, lies a peculiar tale that hops just outside the frame of seriousness: Napoleon's rabbit debacle. Yes, the man who stared down coalitions, revolutionized military tactics, and briefly crowned himself emperor of everything within cannon shot, was once routed by a battalion of fluffy, food-obsessed lagomorphs. But this story is more than just a quirky anecdote. It's a reminder that even the most towering historical figures were, at the end of the day, extremely human, occasionally dignified, often brilliant, and sometimes just hilariously unlucky. It's tempting to treat history like a marble statue, all stiff posture, solemn faces, and tidy labels. But when a man like Napoleon Bonaparte ends up running for his life from a herd of overeager rabbits, the cracks in that marble start to show. And that's a good thing, because in those cracks is where the real richness lives. The humanity, the absurdity, the kind of details that make you raise your eyebrows, laugh out loud, and maybe most importantly, remember the story forever. This bunny fiasco sticks in our cultural memory because it's such a perfect juxtaposition. On one hand, we have Napoleon, the living embodiment of military genius, ego the size of France, and wardrobe choices that screamed, "I'm important." On the other hand, we have rabbits, soft, fuzzy, pink-nosed balls of mischief with the strategic instinct of a sandwich. The collision of these two worlds is pure comedic gold. It's not a tragic fall or a heroic triumph, it's just funny. And that's why it endures. More than 2 centuries later, the story still makes its rounds in history books, with a sense of humor, trivia nights designed to baffle, explainer videos with titles like "When Napoleon Got Dunked On by Bunnies." It shows up because it offers a rare thing in historical storytelling, an unfiltered moment where greatness got humbled by sheer ridiculousness. And while the French Empire survived the incident, Napoleon's ego, perhaps slightly nibbled. But underneath the fluff lies a deeper value. Stories like this one remind us that the past isn't just war maps, birth dates, and dusty treaties. It's full of personality. It's messy, unpredictable, and often deeply silly. And in an age where history can feel dry or overly academic, a tale like Napoleon's rabbit retreat acts like a time-traveling jester, elbowing its way in to say, "Hey, even emperors can have off days." That's not to say we should treat history only as a playground for punchlines. It's a serious study, after all, built on consequences and real people's lives. But the comedic corners, they deserve space too, because they teach us humility, they keep us curious, and they remind us that even in the most rigidly told chronicles of empire and war, someone somewhere was trying to explain to their boss why the bunnies were winning. And what about the moral? Is there a neat lesson tucked between the fluff and the farce? Maybe. It's a story about overconfidence, certainly. A cautionary tale in what happens when you plan an event without doing your rabbit-related research. But more broadly, it's a tale about humanity. Napoleon was many things: strategic genius, tyrant, reformer, egomaniac. But for one sunny afternoon in 1807, he was just a man desperately trying to escape a tide of small fuzzy mouths looking for snacks. That's why we need ridiculous history. Because in stories like these we find the pieces that connect us to the past, not through glory or grandeur, but through shared laughter, awkwardness and surprise. We remember the names not just because of what they built or broke, but because once they too lost a battle they didn't see coming, one they couldn't plan for, one that hopped straight out of the hedges and into legend. If you're the type of person who thinks your cat owns the house, congratulations, you would have fit right in with the ancient Egyptians. Long before pet accounts and dog birthday cakes, there was a civilization where animals weren't just cute companions. They were sacred, revered, occasionally mummified and sent off to the afterlife in style, sometimes with more ceremony than the people who owned them. In short, ancient Egypt wasn't just a society with pets. It was a full-blown petocracy. Let's get one thing straight. Animals in ancient Egypt didn't just fetch sticks or lounge in sunbeams. They mediated between the human and divine. They were earthly stand-ins for gods, cosmic messengers in fur, feathers and scales. Want to be closer to the gods? You could pray, or you could adopt a cat and let the divine lounge on your lap while knocking over pottery. Take cats, for example. These weren't just household companions. They were avatars of Bastet, the feline-headed goddess of home, fertility and protection. A cat curled up on your windowsill wasn't just chasing flies. It was symbolically guarding your household from chaos, evil spirits, and presumably burglars with allergies. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was a capital offense. That's right, step on whiskers, and you could be staring down a death sentence. Peter would have wept tears of joy, but the feline frenzy was just the beginning. Ancient Egyptians had a whole spiritual zoo. Baboons were connected to Thoth, the god of wisdom. Crocodiles were sacred to Sobek, the toothy deity of strength and Nile fertility. Falcons represented Horus, the sky god, while ibises were linked to, you guessed it, Thoth again. Apparently the god of writing and wisdom had both a bird and a baboon as avatars. Talk about range. Then there were mongooses. Yes, mongooses. You might know them as the little warriors that go toe-to-toe with cobras, but the Egyptians knew them as brave defenders of households. Not just a walking furball with a hero complex, mongooses were practical and sacred. Their snake-slaying antics made them ideal guardians in the physical world and symbolic protectors against spiritual threats. Meanwhile, your average household today is guarded by a doorbell camera and some hope. Owning an animal in Egypt wasn't just about companionship, it was about status. A well-fed, pampered pet was a flex. It told the world that you had wealth, piety, and possibly a direct line to the gods. In essence, if you had a falcon perched in your courtyard or a well-groomed baboon in your procession, you weren't eccentric, you were devout and respectable. Pet ownership wasn't about emotional support, it was about divine endorsement. Elite Egyptians even commissioned portraits and statues of their pets, not simple sketches either. Full-on stelae, carvings and temple art. In tombs you could find paintings of deceased nobles alongside their beloved animals, because what's the point of eternal paradise if you can't bring your favorite falcon along? The spiritual hierarchy of animals was complex, but so was the practical management. Egyptians bred animals specifically for religious purposes. Temples ran their own animal farms, producing sacred specimens like industrial holiness factories. In Bubastis, temples dedicated to Bastet housed hundreds, sometimes thousands of cats. It wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a furry theocracy. And don't get too excited thinking only the upper classes could afford spiritual pet ownership. Even commoners participated, though perhaps with slightly less spectacle. Amulets, tiny figurines and simple offerings allowed even the average Egyptian to stay on the god's good side via the animal channel. Though you might not afford a baboon, a small cat charm could still protect your household from misfortune, and it didn't shed. This deep connection to the animal world wasn't limited to life either. Death only made the bond stronger. Pets were often buried alongside their owners, or given their own tombs. Inscriptions commemorated their loyalty and divine connection. If Fido died today and was given a eulogy in hieroglyphics and a linen-wrapped burial, we'd call that eccentric. In Egypt, that was just Tuesday. What made this whole relationship work was the Egyptian worldview itself. Life and death were part of a grand cosmic balance. The Nile flooded, crops grew, people lived, died, and were reborn. Animals fluid, symbolic, and omnipresent, fit perfectly into that cycle. Whether guarding the home, aiding in ritual, or simply reminding people of the gods, they were deeply embedded in both the spiritual and daily fabric of Egyptian life. So if you're ever wondering whether your pampered hamster or sweater-wearing pug is over the top, just remember, in ancient Egypt, animals were royalty. Some had their own priests. Some had temple real estate. Some even had jewelry. You're not crazy. You're just historically accurate. Cats. Small, fluffy, independent, and in ancient Egypt, absolutely divine. While the modern house cat may grace Instagram feeds with sardonic stares and dramatic naps, its ancestors were lounging in alabaster palaces, being worshipped like furry little gods. And rightly so, because in Egypt cats weren't pets. They were royalty with whiskers. Let's start with the headliner, Bastet, the original cat influencer. She began her celestial career as a lion-headed warrior goddess of protection. Think claws, teeth, and righteous fury. But over time she softened into a domestic cat goddess, still fierce but more focused on hearth fertility and keeping the spiritual mouse population under control. She symbolized grace, motherhood, and home. In short, Bastet was the divine embodiment of no, I'm not moving off this cushion, and yes, you may admire me. Temples were built in her honor, especially in the city of Bubastis, which was basically Meowtown, Egypt. Pilgrims traveled from across the country just to celebrate her, participate in raucous festivals, and leave behind bronze or ceramic cat statues as offerings. You think cat ladies today are devoted? Try navigating an ancient religious pilgrimage where everyone's carrying cat figurines and the priesthood is conducting sacred rituals involving real-life purring deities. And the devotion didn't stop at statues. Mummification for cats wasn't just common, it was practically an industry. Skilled embalmers wrapped up feline companions like tiny pharaohs, complete with amulets, sarcophagi, and sometimes even food offerings to keep them fed in the afterlife. Some tombs contain hundreds, yes, hundreds of cat mummies. Archaeologists have unearthed entire cemeteries devoted solely to cats. Imagine being an ancient mouse and discovering your neighborhood backs onto the world's angriest feline graveyard. But here's where things go from adorable to absolute courtroom drama. Killing a cat accidentally or not was a punishable offense. According to various Greek historians who visited Egypt, killing a cat could lead to mob justice. There's even one recorded case of a Roman soldier accidentally killing a cat and being torn apart by an outraged crowd. And this was during Roman rule, when Egypt was already under foreign occupation. That's the kind of judicial power a species gets when they're literally enshrined in religious law. The reverence extended to everyday life. In wealthy households, cats were pampered, protected, and often adorned with jewelry, earrings, necklaces, even tiny gold collars. If you were a noble's cat, you were essentially walking drip. Artists painted them with loving detail on tomb walls, showing them perched under chairs, curled beside their humans, or chasing birds in eternal gardens. These weren't just pets, they were companions in life and guardians in death. And just to emphasize, cats weren't working animals. They weren't herded, yoked, milked, or ridden. Their only job was to exist gracefully. Unlike oxen or donkeys, who had to earn their hay, cats got room, board, and reverence in exchange for being themselves. Perfect scam or divine assignment depends who you ask. Now, before you assume this only applied to the upper class, nope, even common households had a soft spot for cats. They were beloved in villages and cities alike. People believed cats brought good luck and protected the home from vermin and spiritual evil. Kind of like having a furry alarm system that also happened to nap 16 hours a day. But the power cats held wasn't just spiritual, it was symbolic. Their grace, independence, and self-assurance mirrored what Egyptian culture valued: balance, order, harmony. In a world ruled by Mat, the concept of cosmic equilibrium, the cat's ability to straddle both domesticity and wildness, both affection and independence, made it the perfect embodiment of the ideal soul. Basically, if a cat judged you and walked away, it was probably because your spiritual energy was off. So revered were these four-legged divas that Egyptian art and writing even depicted them doing human things like sitting at the dinner table, wearing makeup, or standing proudly beside the pharaoh, not as decoration but as status symbols. If a king had a leopard skin cloak, that was power. If he had a cat lounging beside his throne, that was divine power with whiskers. And while today's cats might knock over your water glass out of spite, their ancient ancestors could knock over your entire legal standing. Because in ancient Egypt, cats didn't just have lives, they had afterlives. In a world where getting mummified meant you were kind of a big deal, ancient Egypt didn't just reserve the linen wraps and perfumed rituals for royalty. No, they extended the full luxury embalming treatment to animals, especially cats. And not just the pets of nobility either. We're talking full-on, spiritually endorsed, mass-scale cat mummification that made the average human burial look like a rushed Thursday afternoon errand. If you were a cat in ancient Egypt, your chances of getting a more glamorous send-off than a minor prince were pretty high. Let's talk about the numbers first, because they're ridiculous. Archaeologists have uncovered millions of mummified cats. Millions. In 1888, a farmer digging near the ancient city of Beni Hassan stumbled upon a cache of cat mummies so vast it took several years to excavate. The count was estimated at around 80,000 feline burials, all packed together in what might as well have been the world's most sacred cat convention. And this wasn't a one-off. Similar deposits have been found all across Egypt, indicating that cat mummification wasn't some niche practice. It was big business, literally, and it really was a business. As the demand for animal mummies rose because nothing says piety like offering a pre-packaged sacred creature to a deity, an entire industry sprung up around their embalming. Temples raised animals specifically to be mummified and sold to pilgrims. That's right, some cats were bred not for companionship, but for their post-life value. These weren't family pets, they were spiritual stock. And while that might sound a little grim, in ancient Egyptian belief, this practice was incredibly meaningful. Offering a mummified cat to Bastet, for instance, was seen as an act of deep devotion, like sending a sacred voicemail directly to the goddess herself. The embalming process was nothing short of meticulous. Depending on the budget and the purpose, cats were sometimes eviscerated, dried and treated with the same care as human mummies. Some were adorned with tiny amulets, had their faces painted or masked to resemble divine beings, and were wrapped in intricately folded linen patterns. Think of it as the animal version of designer burial wear. Gucci linen meets afterlife readiness. But it wasn't just cats, oh no, entire animal cemeteries existed, housing ibises, baboons, falcons, mongooses, and yes, crocodiles, all carefully preserved. The sacred animal necropolis in Saqqara, for example, contained vast galleries for each species. There was essentially a designated VIP lounge for every kind of sacred beast, and like modern cemeteries, these were organized, maintained, and visited. These weren't just discarded remains, they were honored presences, embodied prayers meant to travel into the divine ether. Still, cats reigned supreme. Their association with the home, protection, fertility, and even vengeance made them especially significant. They weren't just fluffy companions, they were believed to ward off evil spirits, bring favor to households, and serve as avatars of the goddess Bastet. In death, their power didn't fade, it simply continued into the afterlife. Now turbocharged by the sacredness of mummification, their little linen-wrapped bodies became holy messengers, the divine in fur coat form, there's also something strangely charming about the little details left behind. Some mummified cats were positioned sitting upright, as if forever on guard duty. Others had their claws carefully clipped, their faces lovingly decorated, or their wrappings tied off with little colored threads. It's clear that whether they were a cherished pet or a temple offering, there was genuine care involved. Ancient Egyptian embalmers may have had conveyor belt efficiency, but they didn't phone it in. And while we might now look back on it with a mixture of awe and incredulous chuckling, really? Cat cemeteries? This practice reveals something deep about the Egyptian worldview. Life was sacred, death was transitional, and animals weren't just beasts. They were fellow travelers through the grand cosmic cycle. A mummified cat wasn't a quirky artifact. It was part of an eternal spiritual conversation between human, animal, and God. Of course, the 19th century had to come in and ruin the moment. When those thousands of cat mummies were discovered at Beni Hassan, a good number weren't preserved in museums. They were shipped to England and sold for fertilizer. That's right, millennia-old spiritual emissaries turned into compost. A moment of silence, please, for the most disrespected mummies in history. Still, the legacy endures. Today, museums around the world preserve these tiny linen-wrapped time capsules, sometimes with X-rays showing the carefully posed skeletons inside. And while the big pyramids and golden sarcophagi may get all the attention, the mummified pets of Egypt tell a quieter, funnier, and somehow even more human story, that love, belief, and reverence aren't reserved for the powerful. Sometimes the creature curled up at your feet gets to be a god too. In a world where cats reign supreme, you might assume dogs were just the underpaid temple interns fetching sandals and waiting for scraps. But in ancient Egypt, dogs weren't second-class citizens. They were divine companions, spiritual bodyguards, and occasionally posthumous celebrities. While cats may have curled up on laps and altars, dogs dug their paws deep into Egypt's most sacred realms, particularly the afterlife. And unlike today's pups, who might shred a couch cushion in under 5 minutes, these ancient canines were helping usher souls into eternity. Let's begin with the head honcho of hounds, Anubis. Jackal-headed, sleek, and perpetually serious, Anubis was the Egyptian god of mummification and the afterlife. You might expect a death deity to be a little gloom and doom, but Anubis was the helpful kind. He embalmed Osiris, weighed the hearts of the dead, and generally kept the underworld from descending into chaos. And the jackal form? Not random. Egyptians often saw jackals prowling around cemeteries, which to them wasn't creepy, it was symbolic. These scavengers became natural guardians of the dead. This association with jackals, and by extension dogs, meant that man's best friend was often viewed as more than just a loyal companion. Dogs were protectors of souls, able to traverse the spiritual boundary between this life and the next. They didn't just guard sheep, they guarded the gates of eternity. And considering some tombs had more booby traps than an Indiana Jones movie, having a loyal dog spirit on your team wasn't a bad idea. Now, it wasn't all divine symbolism and spiritual heavy lifting. Egyptians genuinely loved their dogs in a way that would warm the heart of any modern pet owner. They named them, cared for them, and sometimes gave them accessories. No, your bejeweled poodle isn't a new invention. Archaeologists have found collars, leashes, and name tags from thousands of years ago. Popular dog names included Brave One, Reliable, and the ever-humble Good Watcher. Somewhere out there in the desert sands lies the ancient equivalent of a squeaky bone. These pets were often buried with their owners, a furry farewell that guaranteed no soul would travel into the duat, the Egyptian underworld, alone. In some cases, dogs were given their own tombs. Think about that the next time your dog eats homework. You're looking at an animal that once had pyramid-side real estate. And the funerary love didn't stop at burial. Dogs were mummified with care, wrapped in linen, and sent off with amulets and offerings. Not unlike their feline counterparts, dogs became part of a specialized embalming industry. Some of these mummified pups were personal pets. Others were sacred offerings, People would buy a mummified dog and leave it at a temple as a sort of spiritual thank you note to Anubis. It's the ancient Egyptian version of lighting a candle, except the candle had floppy ears and a tail. Temples dedicated to Anubis, like those at Saqqara and Sinopolis, literally city of dogs, functioned almost like spiritual kennels. Pilgrims came to worship, donate and leave behind embalmed animals. One tomb at Saqqara contained more than 8 million dog mummies. That's not a typo. 8 million. Somewhere out there a team of embalmers spent decades linen wrapping enough dogs to populate an afterlife obedience school. What's more, canine love crossed class boundaries. Pharaohs had dogs, farmers had dogs, soldiers had dogs. In fact, war dogs were occasionally deployed in battles and hunts, their ferocity balanced by loyalty. Some even appeared in official records as heroic figures, sort of like four-legged generals with tail wags. One of the most famous ancient canines was a greyhound named Abu Toiwo, who was so adored by the pharaoh that he was buried with full ceremonial honors. His tomb inscription referred to him as the king's dog, and he received offerings just like a noble. Let that sink in. This dog had a better retirement plan than most modern humans. Of course, not all dogs were equal in status. Some breeds were favored for hunting, others for herding or guarding, but even the most rugged working dogs were considered spiritually significant. The fact that canines could both physically protect homes and spiritually guide souls made them unique among Egypt's animal pantheon. Part bouncer, part therapist, part spiritual GPS. It's easy to laugh at the idea of a dog being spiritually elevated, but then again, is it really that different from how people today treat their pets? Egyptians simply formalized the bond in stone, gold and linen. Their love wasn't sentimental fluff, it was cosmic policy. Dogs were tied to the journey beyond death, and Anubis ensured they had a front row seat in every major spiritual event. So next time your dog rolls in something questionable or eats your shoe, remember, their ancestors once guided pharaohs into the afterlife and guarded eternal souls. You might be dealing with a drooling demigod. The ancient Egyptians didn't just love their cats and dogs, they also had a thing for baboons. Yes, those loud, mischievous, banana-hurling agents of chaos were treated not like pests, but like divine emissaries. In a land where gods had bird heads and pharaohs were part-time deities, it should surprise no one that baboons were given tiny coffins, blessed amulets, and the ancient version of a LinkedIn endorsement from the moon god himself. At the center of this curious monkey mania was Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and the moon. Thoth had multiple forms. He could show up as an ibis, a long-beaked bird that always looked like it had opinions, or as a baboon. Now, choosing to manifest as a baboon says something about your divine brand. It says, I'm wise, a little wild, and occasionally fling things when annoyed. The baboon wasn't just a mascot, it was a symbol of celestial knowledge and the rhythmic passing of time. Ancient Egyptians observed that baboons were particularly vocal at dawn, screaming as the sun rose, which in Egyptian logic meant they were praising the solar god Ra. This made them unofficial cheerleaders of the cosmos, and unlike modern cheerleaders, these ones sometimes bit. Because of this association with the heavens, baboons weren't just respected, they were venerated. They were depicted sitting upright with their hands raised, almost like they were conducting a prayer or giving testimony in the court of the gods. You couldn't walk into a sacred temple without spotting one carved in relief, watching you with those expressive eyes like it knew your deepest secrets and was judging your sandals. Thoth was also the patron of scribes, which in ancient Egypt was the coolest job short of being a pharaoh. Scribes got to hang out in temples, interpret divine will, and not dig ditches in the sun. Since baboons were connected to Thoth, they got honorary roles as spiritual stenographers, little furry librarians of the divine. Some temples even kept baboons on site. These weren't just spiritual decor. Priests believed baboons were capable of understanding the gods on a level humans couldn't. If the local monkey was pacing wildly, it might mean a storm was coming. If it fell asleep mid-ceremony, maybe the god was displeased, or the incense was just too strong. Baboons were sometimes taught basic tasks, like holding ceremonial items or following trained patterns during rituals. And although that sounds adorable, remember, these are creatures who throw tantrums, throw objects, and sometimes throw worshippers. Egyptian priests had to handle sacred baboons and interpret their moods without losing fingers, a divine calling and an occupational hazard. When one of these hallowed baboons passed away, it wasn't dumped into the Nile or left for scavengers. No, it was mummified, anointed, and often placed in a custom-made baboon coffin, sometimes seated, sometimes adorned with painted hieroglyphs that said things like "Great Friend of Thoth" or "Honored Companion in the House of Life." Some of these monkey mummies were even wrapped with tiny amulets to protect their souls in the afterlife. If you've ever wondered whether a baboon needs a spiritual insurance policy to make it to the field of reeds, ancient Egyptians had a firm yes on file. The process wasn't cheap either. Elaborate monkey burials suggest serious investment. These weren't your average temple mascots. They were religious VIPs. Archaeologists have uncovered entire tombs devoted to baboons in places like Tuna el-Gebel, a site in Middle Egypt. Massive catacombs hold mummified baboons stacked like furry scrolls of divine wisdom. Some even had names inscribed on pottery shards, little records of their lives, suggesting they were more than sacred symbols. They were known, loved, and grieved. Of course, not all baboons were divine messengers. Some were just high society chaos agents kept as pets by the wealthy. Elite Egyptians often imported exotic animals for prestige, and a baboon was a particularly flashy flex. Imagine hosting a dinner party, and a baboon swings across the room to steal your duck stew. It's annoying, but impressive. Keeping a monkey meant you were rich, connected, and possibly reckless. These secular baboons weren't left out of the mummy game either. Many pet monkeys were lovingly wrapped, placed beside their owners in tombs, and prepared for an afterlife of divine mischief. Because what's paradise without a baboon to chase beetles and judge your fashion choices? And where there's reverence, there's commerce. The animal mummy industry in ancient Egypt was booming by the late period. Priests and embalmers offered mummified animals as votive offerings for pilgrims. Want to impress Thoth? Buy a baboon mummy. Want to appease the moon god before an exam? Baboon bundle, limited edition. The demand was so high that sometimes corners were cut, like stuffing the mummies with baboon bones that didn't all belong to the same baboon. Divine fraud? Possibly. Profitable? Definitely. Ancient Egypt's love for baboons was wild, reverent, and more than a little unhinged. These loud, unpredictable creatures managed to climb from the jungle floor to the divine pedestal, armed with nothing but screams and sass. In a world of cosmic balance, crocodile gods and cat priestesses, the baboon was the perfect bridge between chaos and order. So the next time you visit a museum and see a mummified monkey in a glass case, remember you're looking at one of Thoth's sacred scribes, a temple troublemaker turned heavenly hype man, and probably, if it were alive, it'd be throwing something at you. In today's world, people might keep crocodiles in zoos, fear them in rivers, or turn them into cartoon villains. But in ancient Egypt, you'd build them a VIP lounge, offer them snacks, wrap them in linen after death, and maybe even name your baby after one. Meet Sobek, the crocodile god who turned every swamp into sacred ground and made cold-blooded reptiles the hottest religious sensation on the Nile. Crocodiles were not exactly warm and cuddly. With their scaly hides, bone-crushing jaws, and casual attitude toward eating anything that moved, they were the Nile's version of a meat grinder. But the Egyptians, in their typically inventive fashion, didn't just fear crocodiles, they worshipped them. Why conquer a beast when you can turn it into a god? Enter Sobek, the crocodile-headed deity of strength, fertility, and protection. Sobek wasn't just a glorified river monster. He was believed to control the Nile's waters, bring fertility to the land, and ward off evil. Want your crops to flourish? Better leave a nice offering for Sobek. Hoping your firstborn doesn't get eaten by actual crocodiles? Light a candle for Sobek. The logic was airtight. Revere the monster, and maybe he won't eat you. In Sobek's strongholds, particularly the cult centers at Crocodilopolis, yes, that was the real name, and Commodus. Priests didn't just talk about crocodiles, they kept them, live ones, in pools, inside the temples. That's right, some temples had sacred ponds housing crocodiles that were pampered like royal guests at a 5-star resort. These weren't your average Nile gators. They were treated with reverence and affection, often given names, fed specially prepared food, including in some cases cakes and honey, and adorned with gold jewelry. Imagine a crocodile waddling around with earrings and eyeliner, and you've got the right mental picture. The temple caretakers, often high-ranking priests, took great pride in their scaly residents. Feeding time was ceremonial. Visitors brought offerings. Local children may or may not have been warned that Sobek could hear you snicker. After all, it was risky business laughing at a divine reptile with 100 teeth. Eventually, even the holiest crocodile meets its match. But death was not the end. It was the beginning of an elaborate funeral process. Just like cats and baboons, sacred crocodiles were mummified with the same religious care as humans. They were carefully embalmed, often wrapped in linen, and sometimes placed in custom-built stone or wooden sarcophagi, shaped like a reclining croc. You haven't truly made it in the afterlife unless you're buried looking smug. But these were not solo burials. Mass crocodile cemeteries have been discovered near Sobek's temples. In places like Fayum and Commodus, archaeologists have unearthed entire catacombs filled with crocodile remains, some mummified with astonishing detail. One site yielded more than 300 crocodile mummies in a single find. Even more intriguing, some of these mummies contain baby crocodiles placed inside the bodies of larger ones, like reptilian nesting dolls. Because when it comes to divine symbolism, 2 crocodiles are always better than 1. But not everyone could keep a full-grown divine crocodile in their home or temple. So what's an average worshipper to do? The answer: bring a mini mummy. These small votive crocodile mummies became popular religious offerings, often made of linen-wrapped remains, or sometimes just shaped to look like crocodiles, no reptile required. They were presented to temples in hopes of earning Sobek's favor. It was like sending a spiritual thank you card, except wrapped in ancient bandages and occasionally dipped in resin. Some families commissioned entire crocodile effigies, complete with painted features and small inscriptions, to be buried alongside their own deceased. These weren't pets. They were divine bodyguards for the afterlife. And nothing says safe spiritual journey like a miniature croc riding shotgun. Sobek's popularity wasn't just a fringe swamp thing. Pharaohs themselves leaned into the croc hype. Some rulers aligned themselves with Sobek's imagery to project strength, virility, and divine favor. One pharaoh, Sobek Neferu, even took his name from the crocodile god, boldly declaring allegiance to scaly supremacy. In times of political uncertainty or environmental crisis like the Nile flooding too much or not enough, Sobek's cult gained momentum. He wasn't just a river deity, he was a symbol of balance between chaos and order. You might fear him, but you also needed him. And when your empire's stability rests on water, fertility, and just enough superstition to keep everyone in line, Sobek is the god you absolutely want on your crocodile-filled team. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where sacred pets didn't just sit in your lap, they practically owned the lap, the chair, and the entire estate. These weren't your average furry companions. They were revered, pampered, and brace yourself, sometimes better funded than your local village school. If you were a sacred animal in ancient Egypt, you didn't just live, you thrived with perks that would make even modern celebrities jealous. In the eyes of the Egyptians, sacred animals were earthly vessels of divine energy. They weren't just like gods, they were gods in fluffy, feathery, or scaly form, which meant that once an animal was declared divine, it essentially got tenure. The temple didn't just feed it, it housed it, clothed it, if applicable, and built an entire entourage of caretakers around it. Some temples had staff members specifically assigned to the care and comfort of one sacred animal, sort of like ancient pet nannies, but with significantly more incense. These animals got regular meals, often of higher quality than the average peasants, luxurious housing, and constant adoration from worshippers. If you were the Appia's bull, for example, You didn't just eat hay, you were dining on specially prepared food, resting on soft bedding, and being bathed and anointed by priests on the daily. And when the animal eventually died, don't worry, the funeral budget was basically blank check. Wealth allocation in temples wasn't just about lighting candles and chanting prayers. A surprising chunk of resources went into sacred animal care. Entire economic subsystems grew around the divine pet industrial complex. Fields were cultivated to feed them. Laborers were employed to maintain their lodgings. Artisans crafted amulets and accessories. Scribes recorded their every sneeze, just in case the gods were trying to say something. In the city of Thebes, there are records of goats receiving blessed water, luxury pens and offerings that rival those for human nobles. In Memphis, sacred bulls walk through the city in full regalia, surrounded by chanting priests and awestruck citizens. And in Saqqara, some of the wealthiest burial chambers ever uncovered belonged not to pharaohs or priests, but to animals like sacred ibises and baboons. Yes, we're saying a goose may have had a more extravagant tomb than your average human ruler. Sacred animals didn't just lounge around, they held titles, literally. The API's bull, for instance, wasn't just a cow with good PR. He was Herald of Pitta and Lord of Heaven, titles that placed him directly in the celestial pecking order. Some cats were referred to as Mistress of the House or Divine Protectress, roles complete with ceremonial duties, public appearances, and even spiritual guarding roles. These animals participated in processions and rituals, sometimes even decked out in ceremonial clothing and jewelry. Think of it as a red carpet event, but instead of paparazzi, you've got thousands of devout citizens throwing flower petals and chanting hymns. Not a bad gig, considering you don't have to answer emails. Of course, supply couldn't always meet demand. So what do you do when your divine crocodile passes away and you need a new Sobek pronto? You turn to ancient Egypt's sacred animal breeders. Yes, there was a system for this. Temples maintained breeding programs for animals considered holy. The idea was to raise the next generation of divine avatars in a controlled sacred environment. Think puppy mill, but with more gold leaf and hymns. Once an animal showed the right divine signs, sometimes physical features, sometimes a priest's spiritual declaration, it was whisked away to begin its gilded career. This wasn't just about faith, it was big business. Families who supplied these animals gained prestige, donations from worshippers rolled in, and the temple's reputation soared. In many cases, the divine pet's reputation helped fund the temple itself. The better your holy goose, the more pilgrims came to offer coins, food, or animal-shaped trinkets. The presence of sacred animals shifted local economies. Towns with temples dedicated to these animals often saw booms in trade, tourism, pilgrims, and artisan crafts. Traders brought exotic animal food, carvers and painters sold mementos, priests wrote scrolls and hymns in praise of the creature. It was a full-on divine marketplace centered around a single, usually indifferent animal. Some temples became so rich off their pets that they rivaled state power. The line between divine worship and economic exploitation blurred. But let's be honest, if your mummified cat brings in thousands of silver pieces a year, you're not asking too many questions. When these animals passed, it wasn't grab a shovel and say a few words. No, it was commission a solid gold sarcophagus, embalm the beast with a spice blend that cost more than your house, and begin a 70-day mourning ceremony complete with flute players. Some funerals even involved public holidays. Cities shut down, people fasted, musicians played dirges. The animal's body would be embalmed, wrapped in linen, sometimes covered in resin, then buried with items for the afterlife, mini furniture, tiny food jars, ceremonial jewelry, and in some cases letters written to the gods. Ancient Egypt wasn't just a land of pyramids and pharaohs. It was a society where your spiritual rank could be determined by how many paws, hooves, or beaks you had. These animals weren't just pets, they were institutions. And if you ever feel like your cat acts like it owns the place, maybe it's just remembering a past life. The ancient Egyptians may have perfected the art of turning animals into divine icons, but modern civilization took one look and said, "Hold my squeaky toy." From gilded feline mummies to entire museum exhibits about crocodile cults, the obsession lives on. It turns out that wrapping your pets in linen and treating them like royalty was just the opening act of a 3,000-year-long global phenomenon that we still can't quite quit. Let's begin with a familiar scene. You walk into a museum and head toward the Egyptian wing. There, behind glass, lies a tiny, perfectly wrapped bundle. Not a pharaoh, not a priest. A cat, complete with hieroglyphic tags, and sometimes even X-rays revealing that yes, it's an actual feline inside, not just an elaborately wrapped cabbage, although those do exist too, thanks forgers of antiquity. Pet mummies have become a staple in museum collections worldwide, from the British Museum to the Louvre to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. They're not just curiosities, they're cultural artifacts, testaments to how deeply ancient Egyptians loved, revered, and mythologized their animal companions. They didn't see animals as lesser beings. They saw them as messengers, protectors, and sometimes literal gods in fur coats. But the reverence didn't end with mummification. Animal cults were intricate, state-sponsored systems. Sacred creatures were not just pampered in life and embalmed in death. They were remembered and honored for generations. Modern museums now take care to preserve these mummified remains, with the same reverence one might afford a noble dignitary. Ironically, a crocodile might have better climate control today than many humans did during their lifetimes. And while the ancient temples of Bubastes or Crocodilopolis, yes, that was a real place, may have long crumbled, their spiritual successors exist on Instagram. Ancient Egyptians built shrines, we build hashtags. Instead of linen-wrapped purr machines, we now scroll through thousands of cats in bow ties, dogs in strollers, and parrots with TikTok careers. In many ways, we're simply continuing a tradition that's been around for millennia. Ancient Egyptians adorned their pets with jewelry. Today, we buy them custom collars with GPS tracking and rhinestones. They hosted elaborate animal funerals. We offer pet cremation with urns shaped like angel wings, and the phrase fur baby. Well, it turns out the original phrase was probably divine household guardian and occasional food thief. Even the afterlife planning has eerie parallels. Egyptians prepared animals with care for their journey to the next world. Tiny food offerings, amulets, the works. Today you can find companies offering pet burial kits, memorial jewelry made from fur, and even services to have your dog's DNA launched into space. Anubis would be proud. But it's not just about emotional connection. There's a cultural continuity at play. The mythology surrounding animals as protectors, guides, and even incarnations of divine will has trickled down through centuries. You see it in folklore, religion, literature, and now pop culture. This resurrection of ancient animal mystique also fuels a thriving tourist industry. Egypt's ancient pet cemeteries, once looted or ignored, are now archaeological hotspots. Visitors come to see the remains of mummified monkeys or crocodiles lovingly laid to rest, complete with linen wrappings, symbolic offerings, and in some cases tiny sarcophagi that scream, yes, even this goose was sacred. There's even a scientific angle. Bioarchaeologists are studying pet mummies to learn about animal health, veterinary practices, and even mass breeding operations in ancient temples. It's CSI Animal Edition, with the occasional divine backstory, and perhaps most importantly, these animals bridge a human gap. Pets remained a constant, a source of joy, companionship, and purpose. They were protectors in life, companions in death, and avatars of the sacred. Sound familiar? So next time your dog barks at nothing, or your cat knocks something off the shelf with unblinking disdain, take comfort in this. They're not just being weird, they're honoring a spiritual lineage that goes back to the Nile. A lineage that once granted baboons divine status, buried crocodiles with pomp, and gave cats the run of the kingdom. The ancient Egyptians walked their pets like gods. Today we chase ours with treat bags. But deep down, it's all the same adoration, just with more squeaky toys and fewer amulets.